Hey, come sit with me for a moment. You don't have to explain why you're awake. I can tell it's been a long night. Let's keep things simple. 5 quiet stories, the rain outside, and nothing else you need to handle right now. Let everything slow down for a while. Story 1. A stranger asked if I heard the baby crying. The woman stopped me on a Tuesday evening, just as the streetlights were flickering on. I'd been living in the neighborhood for about 3 weeks by then, still learning which streets connected to which, still figuring out the rhythms of the place. It was a quiet area on the northern edge of the city, old bungalows and craftsman houses from the 1940s, big trees that dropped leaves into yards nobody raked, the kind of neighborhood where people kept to themselves and didn't ask too many questions. I'd chosen it specifically for that reason. After everything that had happened with Marcus, I wanted to disappear into a place where no one would notice me. The woman was standing on the sidewalk outside my rental house when I came home from work, just standing there like she'd been waiting. She was older, maybe late 60s, with gray hair pulled back in a tight bun and the kind of weathered face that suggested she'd spent most of her life outdoors. I didn't recognize her from the few neighbors I'd met, and something about her stillness made me slow down as I approached. "You're the one who moved into the Denton house," she said. Not a question. I stopped a few feet away, keys already in my hand, that automatic wariness that women learn to carry with them after dark. "Can I help you with something?" "Have you heard it yet?" She stepped closer, and I could see her eyes now, pale blue, watery, fixed on my face with an intensity that made me want to step back. "The baby. Have you heard the baby crying?" I blinked at her, confused. "I'm sorry?" "At night, usually between 2 and 3 in the morning, a baby crying somewhere close, like it's right outside your window, or in the walls, or..." She stopped herself, pressing her lips together like she'd said too much. "You haven't heard it. Good. Maybe you won't." She turned and walked away before I could respond, moving down the sidewalk with a speed that seemed wrong for her age. I watched her until she disappeared around the corner, my keys still clutched in my hand, my heart beating faster than it should have been. The whole interaction had lasted less than a minute, but something about it left me shaken in a way I couldn't explain. My name is Thea Marchetti. I was 29 years old that October, working night shifts as an ER nurse at the hospital downtown, trying to rebuild a life that had fallen apart 6 months earlier when I discovered my husband had been living a double existence I knew nothing about. The divorce was still being finalized. I was still finding pieces of the person I used to be and trying to figure out which ones were worth keeping. The house on Caldwell Street, the Denton house apparently, was supposed to be a fresh start. Cheap rent, quiet neighborhood, a place to heal without anyone watching. I didn't think about the woman's question that first night. Told myself she was just a neighborhood eccentric, one of those people every block has, who says strange things and gets avoided at community events. I made dinner, watched something forgettable on television, went to bed early because I had a shift starting at 11. The house was quiet around me. No traffic noise, no neighbors arguing through thin walls, none of the sounds I'd grown used to in the apartment I'd shared with Marcus. Just silence and the occasional creak of the old house settling into itself. I didn't hear any baby crying. I slept straight through until my alarm went off at 10, and I drove to work, feeling more rested than I had in months. But the woman's words stayed with me. Something about the way she'd asked, the urgency in her voice, the fear in those pale eyes, had planted itself in my brain like a splinter I couldn't quite reach. Over the next few days, I started paying attention to the neighborhood in ways I hadn't before. Noticed that there were no children on Caldwell Street at all, actually. No toys in yards, no bikes on porches, no sounds of kids playing after school. The houses were occupied. I could see lights in windows, cars in driveways, but the people who lived in them were all older. Retired couples, single elderly residents, the occasional middle-aged person who came and went without ever making eye contact. I asked my landlord about it when he came by to fix a leaky faucet. Mr. Yates was a quiet man in his 50s who owned several properties in the area and didn't seem interested in small talk, but he paused when I mentioned the woman who'd stopped me on the sidewalk. Gray hair, blue eyes, probably told you something strange. He shook his head, turning back to the faucet. That's Dolores Finch, lives over on Maple. She's been saying things like that for years. Don't pay her any attention. She asked if I'd heard a baby crying, I said. Is there something I should know about this house? Mr. Yates was quiet for a moment, his hands still working the wrench. When he spoke again, his voice was careful, measured. The Dentons lived here for 30 years. Good people. They're both gone now. Natural causes, nothing strange. The house sat empty for a while before I bought it. That's all there is to know. He finished the repair and left without saying goodbye. I stood in my kitchen afterward, listening to the silence of the empty house, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he hadn't answered my actual question. The first time I heard the crying was 5 nights later. I'd come home from a brutal shift, 3 car accidents and a cardiac arrest that we couldn't save, and fallen into bed around 8 a.m., exhausted beyond thought. I slept hard and dreamless for hours, and then something pulled me awake. I lay there in the gray afternoon light, disoriented, not sure what had woken me. The house was quiet. The street outside was quiet. I was about to roll over and go back to sleep when I heard it. A baby crying, faint but unmistakable, coming from somewhere outside my bedroom window. That thin, desperate wail that every human being is hardwired to respond to, the sound of an infant in distress. I got out of bed and went to the window, pulled back the curtain, looked out at the empty backyard and the wooden fence and the overgrown hedges that separated my property from the neighbors. Nothing moved. No one was there. But the crying continued, rising and falling, so close it sounded like it was coming from just beneath my window, just out of sight. And then it stopped, cut off mid-wail, like someone had pressed a mute button on the world. I stood at that window for a long time, waiting for it to start again, my heart pounding and my skin crawling with a fear I couldn't name. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the sound had been, because silence, I was starting to understand, didn't mean the baby wasn't there. It just meant the baby had stopped crying. I tried to convince myself I'd imagined it. The exhaustion of a 12-hour shift, the disorientation of waking in the middle of the afternoon, the power of suggestion from Dolores Finch's strange warning. Any of those could explain what I'd heard. Brains are pattern recognition machines, and sometimes they find patterns that aren't there. I'd learned that in nursing school, in psychology courses, in the countless hours I'd spent talking patients through panic attacks and delusions. The mind plays tricks. That's just what minds do. But I couldn't stop thinking about the way the crying had sounded. So real, so immediate, so close. Not a distant sound carried on the wind from some other street. Not a cat or a bird or any of the other animals people mistake for crying babies. This had been right outside my window, desperate and keening, the cry of an infant who needed something it wasn't getting. I started sleeping with my window closed after that, even though the October nights were mild and I'd always preferred fresh air. Started wearing earplugs on the nights I didn't have to work, telling myself it was just to block out neighborhood noise. But I knew the real reason. I didn't want to hear it again. I didn't want to lie there in the dark and wonder if there really was a baby somewhere, suffering, while I did nothing. 3 nights passed without incident. I worked, I slept, I went through the motions of my new life in this quiet neighborhood on this quiet street. I started to relax, started to believe that it really had been my imagination, or a one-time fluke, or some perfectly rational explanation I just hadn't figured out yet. Then I met Dolores Finch again. She was waiting for me at the end of my driveway this time, standing under the big oak tree that dropped leaves onto my front walk every night. It was late afternoon, golden light slanting through the branches, the kind of perfect autumn day that made everything feel safe and ordinary. But there was nothing ordinary about the look on her face when she saw me coming. "You heard it," she said. I can tell. You have that look now. I stopped at the edge of my property, keeping distance between us. Mrs. Finch, right? I don't mean to be rude, but I'm not sure what you're talking about. Dolores. She stepped closer, and I could see that she'd been crying recently. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her cheeks blotchy. Don't lie to me. I've lived on this street for 43 years. I know what that sound does to people. I know what it looks like when someone's heard it for the first time. Something in her voice made me stop pretending. Maybe it was the grief in it, or the exhaustion, or the way she seemed so certain that I'd understand. Okay, I said quietly. Yes, I heard something a few nights ago. It sounded like a baby crying, but when I looked outside, there was nothing there. Dolores nodded like I'd confirmed something she already knew. It's been happening for 31 years, ever since the Denton baby disappeared. The words hit me like cold water. The Denton baby? You didn't know. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. Of course you didn't. They don't tell anyone who rents that house. They just take your money and hope you won't ask questions. She gestured toward my front door, toward the house I'd been sleeping in for almost a month. In 1993, a 6-month-old baby vanished from that house, right out of her crib in the middle of the night. Her name was Lily Denton. They never found her. I felt something cold settle into my stomach, that particular dread that comes from realizing you've been missing something important. What happened? Was she kidnapped? That's what the police said. That's what everyone wanted to believe. Dolores shook her head slowly, her eyes fixed on the house behind me. But I was there that night. I lived 3 doors down, and I was the first one the mother called when she woke up and found the crib empty. The windows were locked. The doors were locked. There was no sign that anyone had broken in or out. That baby didn't leave through any door or window in that house. She just vanished. I wanted to argue with her, to point out that locked rooms aren't really locked, that there's always an explanation for things that seem impossible, but the words wouldn't come. All I could think about was the crying I'd heard, the way it had sounded so close, so desperate, so real. The crying started about a month after Lily disappeared, Dolores continued. Her parents were the first to hear it, then the neighbors, then everyone on the street one by one. It drove the Dentons mad. They couldn't stay in that house, couldn't sell it, couldn't escape the sound of their daughter crying for them every night. They died within 2 years of each other. Broken hearts, the doctors said. But I think they just couldn't take it anymore. She reached out and grabbed my arm, her fingers surprisingly strong. You need to leave that house. I don't know what happened to Lily Denton, and I don't know why we can still hear her crying after all these years. But I know this. Everyone who's lived in that house since the Dentons has heard it eventually, and not all of them have left. I stared at her, my mouth dry. What do you mean, not all of them have left? Dolores released my arm and stepped back, something shifting in her expression, a door closing, a wall going up. Ask Mr. Yates about the tenants who came before you. Ask him how many there have been in the past 30 years, and how many of them are still accounted for. She turned and started walking away, then paused and looked back over her shoulder. And whatever you do, don't go looking for her. The crying is bad enough. But the silence after, that's when she's listening. That's when she decides if you're the one who's going to help her. She was gone before I could ask what she meant. I stood in my driveway as the sun sank lower and the shadows stretched longer, watching her disappear around the same corner she'd vanished around weeks before. The golden light was fading now, and my house looked different in the growing dusk, darker, older, full of spaces I hadn't explored and histories I didn't understand. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat in my living room with every light on, listening to the silence, waiting for it to break. It did. At exactly 2:47 a.m., the crying started again. This time, it was coming from inside the walls. I didn't sleep that night or the next. The crying would start sometime after 2 a.m. and continue for hours, drifting through the house like smoke, sometimes from the walls, sometimes from the ceiling, sometimes from directly beneath the floor where I was standing. I'd press my ear against the plaster and hear it clearly, that thin, desperate wail, and then I'd move to another room, and it would follow me, always just out of reach, always just beyond whatever barrier separated my world from wherever Lily Denton had gone. I called Mr. Yates on the third day, running on coffee and adrenaline and a growing certainty that I was losing my mind. Told him I was hearing sounds in the walls, that I needed an exterminator or a contractor or someone who could explain what was happening. He was quiet for a long moment after I finished, and when he spoke, his voice had that same careful quality I'd noticed before. "I can send someone to take a look," he said. "But Ms. Marchetti, I should tell you, other tenants have reported similar things. We've had the house inspected multiple times. There's nothing in the walls, no animals, no structural issues, nothing that would explain what you're hearing." "Then what is it?" My voice cracked on the last word. I was so tired, so scared, so desperate for an answer that made sense. Dolores Finch told me about the Denton baby. She told me this has been happening for 30 years. "You knew about this when you rented me this house, didn't you?" Another silence, longer this time. "I'll have my contractor come by tomorrow," he said finally. "In the meantime, I'd suggest you don't spend too much time listening to Dolores. She's not well. She hasn't been well for a long time." He hung up before I could respond. I started researching that afternoon, sitting at my kitchen table with my laptop and a pot of coffee that did nothing to cut through the fog of exhaustion. The Denton case was easy enough to find. Newspaper archives from 1993 had been digitized, and Lily's disappearance had been front-page news for weeks. The details matched what Dolores had told me. 6-month-old baby, vanished from her crib, no signs of forced entry, no suspects ever identified. The case had gone cold within a year, and the last article I could find was from 1995, a brief mention that the Denton family had left the area and the house had been sold. But that wasn't what made my blood run cold. What made my blood run cold was the list I compiled of everyone who'd lived in the house since then. It took hours of searching through property records, rental listings, and old social media posts, but I eventually pieced together a timeline. Since 1995, the house on Caldwell Street had been rented to at least 7 different tenants. 3 of them had moved out after less than 6 months, citing personal reasons in the lease termination documents I'd managed to find. 2 had simply stopped paying rent and disappeared. No forwarding address, no response to the landlord's attempts to contact them. Nothing. 1 had been reported missing by her family in 2011 and was never found. The 7th tenant was listed as current. That was me. I sat back in my chair, staring at the screen, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my temples. 2 disappearances, 1 missing person case, and 3 others who'd fled the house like something was chasing them. Dolores had been right. Not everyone who lived here had left. Some of them had simply stopped existing, swallowed up by whatever had taken Lily Denton 31 years ago. The crying started earlier that night, before midnight, while I was still awake and watching the walls like they might split open at any moment. It was louder than before, more insistent, and there was something different about it, a quality I couldn't quite name, something almost like recognition. Like whatever was making that sound knew I'd been looking for it, knew I'd been asking questions, knew I was starting to understand. I followed the sound through the house without meaning to, drawn by that desperate wail the same way any human would be drawn to a suffering child. It led me down the hallway, past the bathroom, to a door at the end I'd been using for storage. I'd thrown boxes in there when I'd moved in and hadn't opened it since. Now the crying was coming from the other side, clear and unmistakable, so close I could almost feel the breath behind it. I opened the door. The room was empty except for my boxes, stacked against the far wall where I'd left them. But something was different. The wallpaper, old, faded, a pattern of yellow flowers I'd never really looked at before, had been torn away in one corner, revealing the plaster beneath. And scratched into that plaster, in jagged letters that looked like they'd been carved with fingernails, were 2 words: "Find me." The crying stopped the moment I read them. That sudden, absolute silence that Dolores had warned me about, the silence that meant she was listening. I stood in that doorway, staring at those words, and I felt something shift in the air around me. A presence, an attention. Something that had been waiting a very long time for someone to see what it had written, to understand what it was asking. I should have run, should have grabbed my keys and my phone and left that house forever, driven back to the city, found somewhere else to live, anywhere else. But I couldn't move, couldn't look away from those 2 words, carved into the wall by hands I couldn't see, asking for something I didn't know how to give. The temperature in the room dropped. My breath fogged in front of my face, and I could feel cold pressing in from all sides, seeping through my clothes, settling into my bones. And then, from somewhere very close, close enough to touch, close enough to feel, I heard a new sound. Not crying this time, breathing, soft and slow and patient, like something standing right behind me, waiting to see what I would do next. I turned around slowly, every muscle in my body screaming at me to run. The hallway behind me was empty, just shadows and the dim glow of the lamp I'd left on in the living room. But the breathing continued, so close I could almost feel it stirring the hair on the back of my neck. It wasn't coming from any direction I could identify. It was simply there, present, filling the space around me like the cold that had seeped into my bones. "What do you want?" My voice came out as a whisper, cracked and trembling. "I don't know how to find you. I don't know where you are." The breathing stuttered, caught, became something that might have been a sob. And then, from the storage room behind me, I heard something else, a soft, scraping sound, like fingernails on plaster. I turned back to the doorway and watched as new letters appeared in the wall beneath the words I'd already read, carved by an invisible hand into the old horsehair plaster. "Under the floor." I stared at those words for a long moment, my mind struggling to process what they meant. Under the floor. Under this floor, this room, this house I'd been sleeping in for weeks. Whatever had happened to Lily Denton, whatever had taken her from her crib 31 years ago, it hadn't taken her far. She'd been here the whole time, right beneath the feet of everyone who'd walked through these rooms, cried in these hallways, vanished without a trace. The breathing faded into silence. The cold receded, slow and reluctant, like something pulling back to give me room. I stood alone in the hallway with those words glowing in the beam of my flashlight, and I understood what was being asked of me. Not just to find her, to free her, to do what no one else had done in 31 years. I should have called the police, should have walked out of that house and told someone with authority, someone with resources, someone who could handle what I'd found. But I thought about the other tenants, the ones who'd disappeared, the one who'd been reported missing and never found. I thought about how many times this house had been inspected, how many people had lived here without ever discovering the truth. Whatever was under that floor, it had been hiding for 3 decades. If I left now, if I gave anyone else a chance to cover it up again, it might hide for 3 more. I found a crowbar in the garage, left behind by some previous tenant, or maybe by the Dentons themselves. The storage room floor was old hardwood, warped and loose in places, and it came up easier than I expected. I worked in near darkness, guided only by my flashlight propped against one of my moving boxes, the beam cutting a pale line across the room as I pried up board after board. The smell hit me before I saw anything. That distinct, unmistakable odor of decay, faint after so many years, but still present, still recognizable to anyone who'd spent time in hospitals or morgues or any of the other places where death leaves its mark. I gagged, pressed my sleeve over my nose, and kept working. The crying had started again, soft and encouraging, coming from somewhere below me like a voice guiding me forward. I pulled up the last board, and shone my flashlight into the crawl space beneath. She was there, what was left of her anyway, tiny bones wrapped in the rotted remains of a pink blanket, curled into a corner of the crawl space like she'd been placed there gently, carefully, by someone who wanted her hidden but not harmed. 31 years of dust and decay hadn't erased her entirely. She was still recognizable as what she'd been, a baby, an infant, someone's daughter who'd been taken from her crib and buried beneath the floor of her own home. The crying stopped. The silence that followed was different this time. Not watchful, not waiting, but peaceful. Released. I knelt at the edge of that hole in the floor, looking down at Lily Denton's remains, and I felt something lift from the air around me. A weight I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying. A presence that had been pressing against the walls of this house for longer than I'd been alive. I called the police at 4:17 a.m., sat on my front porch in the cold October darkness, wrapped in a blanket, and waited for the sirens. They came with lights and questions and a kind of controlled chaos that felt surreal after the silence of what I'd just experienced. I told them I'd heard sounds under the floor, that I'd investigated, that I'd found what I found. They didn't ask how I'd known where to look. Maybe they didn't want to know. The investigation that followed lasted for months. Forensic teams excavated the crawl space, identified the remains through dental records that had been kept on file since the original missing person case. Lily Denton was officially declared dead, her case reclassified from missing to homicide. The newspapers ran stories about the cold case solved after 30 years, and for a little while, the house on Caldwell Street was famous again. They never found out who put her there. The Dentons were both dead, and there were no other suspects, no evidence pointing to anyone who might have taken that baby from her crib and hidden her 10 feet away from where her parents slept. The detective who interviewed me had a theory. He thought it might have been the father, some kind of psychotic break, a man who'd buried his own daughter and then convinced himself she'd been kidnapped. But there was no way to prove it. The truth had died with the Dentons, and all that remained was the fact of what had been done. I didn't stay to hear the end of it. Couldn't stay in that house another night, even knowing that what I'd heard was gone now, at peace, no longer crying out from beneath the floorboards for someone to find her. Some places hold on to their tragedies too tightly, and no amount of resolution can make them feel safe again. But before I left, I visited Dolores Finch one last time. She lived in a small yellow house on Maple Street, just 3 blocks from Caldwell. The yard was overgrown but not neglected, wildflowers instead of weeds, the kind of deliberate chaos that suggested someone who'd stopped caring about appearances, but hadn't stopped caring entirely. I knocked on her door on a gray afternoon, 2 days after the police had finished their excavation, and she opened it like she'd been expecting me. "You found her," she said. Not a question. Her eyes were red again, the way they'd been that day in my driveway, but something in her face had changed, softened, like a tension she'd been carrying for decades had finally begun to ease. I found her. I stood on her porch, not sure if I should ask to come in, not sure what I was even doing there. I wanted to thank you for warning me, for telling me the truth when no one else would. Dolores stepped back and gestured for me to enter. Her house was small and cluttered, every surface covered with books and photographs and the accumulated debris of a long life. She led me to a sitting room where afternoon light filtered through lace curtains, and she lowered herself into an armchair that had clearly been hers for years, molded to the shape of her body. "I knew her mother," she said quietly, once I'd taken a seat across from her. "Susan Denton. We were friends before Lily was born. I watched that woman's whole world light up when she had a baby, and then I watched it fall apart when that baby disappeared." She paused, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze distant. "I was one of the ones who searched. We looked everywhere, the woods behind the neighborhood, the drainage ditches, every abandoned building within a mile. It never occurred to any of us to look under the floor of her own house." "The detective thinks it might have been the father," I said carefully. "Richard Denton. Some kind of breakdown." Dolores nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. Richard was a strange man. Quiet, kept to himself. Susan used to say he had dark moods, times when he'd go somewhere inside his head and she couldn't reach him. She met my eyes, and there was something old and heavy in her gaze. I wondered, after everything happened, the way he acted during the search, the way he looked at that house like it was a trap he couldn't escape. But I never said anything. I didn't have proof. And Susan was my friend, and I didn't want to believe it. "You couldn't have known," I said. "No." She shook her head. But I heard that crying for 31 years, and I never once tried to find out where it was coming from. I just warned people to leave, told them to get out before it was too late. I thought I was protecting them, but really, I was just protecting myself from having to face what I suspected all along. Her voice broke on the last words, and she pressed a hand to her mouth, composing herself. "You did what I was too afraid to do. You listened, you looked, and you found her." We sat in silence for a while after that, the two of us alone with the weight of what had been uncovered. I thought about Susan Denton, about the mother who'd lost her child and never known she was sleeping 10 feet above her body. I thought about Richard Denton, about whatever darkness had driven him to do what he'd done and then live with it until it killed him. I thought about the other tenants, the ones who'd disappeared, and I wondered if they'd come close to finding the truth before something or someone stopped them. "What happened to the others?" I asked finally. "The tenants who vanished. Do you think they found what I found?" Dolores was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know," she said. "I've thought about it over the years. Some of them left in the night without telling anyone. Some of them just stopped being seen. Mr. Yates always had an explanation. They'd moved. They'd broken their lease. They'd gone back to wherever they came from. But I never believed him." She looked at me with those pale, watery eyes. "That house has secrets, Thea. Maybe you found the biggest one, but I don't think it's the only one." I left Dolores's house with more questions than I'd arrived with, but also with something like peace. Lily Denton had been found. Her remains had been identified. Her case had been closed, and whatever had kept her crying out from beneath those floorboards for 31 years had finally been allowed to rest. That had to count for something. That had to be enough. I moved out of the Denton house a week later. Didn't take anything except my clothes and my important documents. Left the furniture, the dishes, everything that had spent any time inside those walls. I broke my lease without penalty because Mr. Yates was suddenly very eager to avoid any more attention, any more questions about what he'd known and when he'd known it. I drove out of that neighborhood on a cold October morning and didn't look back. I live in a different city now, a different state, somewhere with no history I have to carry and no secrets buried under the floor. I went back to nursing, back to the ER, back to the work that makes me feel like I'm helping people instead of failing them. The divorce was finalized 6 months ago. I've started dating again, tentatively, carefully, the way you do when you're learning to trust yourself after a long time of not trusting anyone. I don't hear crying anymore. Don't wake up in the middle of the night with that desperate wail echoing in my ears. Don't feel that cold presence watching me from the corners of rooms. Whatever Lily Denton needed, I gave it to her. Whatever she was waiting for, she finally received. But sometimes, when I'm falling asleep in my new apartment with its solid floors and its empty walls, I think about what Dolores said, about secrets, about the other tenants who disappeared without a trace, whose fates were never explained. I think about that house on Caldwell Street, sitting empty again, waiting for the next person who's desperate enough to take cheap rent and not ask questions. And I wonder what else might be buried under that floor. What else might be waiting to be found? What else might start crying in the middle of the night, calling out for someone to listen? I hope whoever moves in next is paying attention. I hope they trust their instincts when something feels wrong. And I really, truly hope, that if they hear something that doesn't make sense, they don't do what everyone else did for 31 years. I hope they don't just walk away and pretend they didn't hear it. Because sometimes the crying isn't just noise. Sometimes it's a voice that's been waiting decades for someone brave enough to answer. Story 2. My phone alarm went off at a time I never set. The first time it happened, I assumed I'd made a mistake. I woke to the sound of my phone's alarm, that default chime I'd never bothered to change, screaming from my nightstand at 3:33 a.m. I fumbled for it in the dark, squinting against the bright screen, and silenced it without really thinking. Must have set it by accident, I told myself. Must have tapped the wrong thing while setting my actual alarm for 7 o'clock. It happens. Phones are complicated. I went back to sleep and forgot about it by morning. The second time, 3 nights later, I didn't forget. Same alarm. Same time. 3:33 a.m. glowing on my screen like an accusation. I sat up in bed and stared at it, fully awake now, trying to understand how this could have happened twice. I hadn't touched my alarm settings since the first incident. I was certain of that. I worked in IT support, had for 6 years, and I knew my way around a phone better than most people knew their way around their own kitchens. I didn't make accidental settings changes. I didn't tap things. I didn't mean to tap. Something was wrong. My name is Grant Holloway. I was 28 that winter, living in a basement apartment in a neighborhood I couldn't quite afford, working a job that paid just enough to keep me in debt. The apartment was a compromise. Half below ground, small windows near the ceiling that let in just enough light to remind me what I was missing. I'd moved in 8 months earlier after my roommate situation fell apart, and I'd been telling myself it was temporary ever since. The kind of temporary that starts to feel permanent if you're not careful. I checked my alarm settings after the second incident, went through every screen and submenu looking for some explanation. There was only one alarm saved, 7 a.m., weekdays, the same one I'd been using for years. No 3:33, no mystery timer, nothing that could explain what had woken me up 2 times in the same week. I deleted all my alarms and set a fresh one. Restarted my phone. Told myself that whatever glitch had caused this, it was fixed now. Technology does strange things sometimes. That's just reality. The third time was 5 nights later, and I was ready for it. I'd been sleeping lightly, waiting without admitting I was waiting. When the alarm went off at 3:33, that same default chime, that same impossible time, I grabbed my phone immediately and checked the screen. The alarm notification was there, clear as day. Alarm, 3:33 a.m. But when I opened my clock app, there was nothing. No alarm set for that time. No record of one ever existing. Just my 7 a.m. weekday alarm sitting there like it was the only one that had ever been. I didn't go back to sleep that night. Sat up in bed with the lights on, scrolling through forums and tech support pages, looking for anyone who'd experienced something similar. I found a few threads about phantom alarms, ghost notifications, the kind of glitches that happen when software updates don't install correctly, or when apps conflict with each other in ways developers never anticipated. None of them matched what I was experiencing. None of them explained how an alarm could go off without existing in my settings. At work the next day, I asked one of the senior techs about it. Ramirez had been doing IT support for 15 years and had seen pretty much everything a phone could do wrong. He listened to my story with the patient expression of someone who'd heard a lot of dumb questions, then shrugged. "Factory reset," he said. "If it's a software issue, that'll fix it. If it keeps happening after that, you've either got malware or a hardware problem. Get a new phone." I didn't want to factory reset. I had years of photos on that phone, messages from people who weren't in my life anymore, the accumulated digital debris of a decade of existence. But I backed everything up that night, wiped the phone clean, and started fresh. New settings, new configurations. Nothing carried over except the essentials. The alarm went off at 3:33 a.m. the next night. I lay there in the dark, listening to that chime repeat, and I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not frustration, not confusion, fear. Because this wasn't a glitch anymore. This wasn't a software conflict or a corrupted file or any of the rational explanations I'd been clinging to. Something was setting that alarm. Something that wasn't me. Something that had access to my phone in ways I couldn't explain. Something that wanted me awake at exactly 3:33 in the morning. I silenced the alarm and got out of bed. My apartment was dark, except for the glow of streetlights filtering through those small windows near the ceiling, casting long rectangles of pale light across my floor. I stood in the center of my living room and listened. The building was quiet. The street outside was quiet. The whole world felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something I couldn't see. That's when I noticed it. A shadow in one of the window wells, those concrete depressions outside my basement windows, designed to let light in and keep water out. Someone was standing in one of them, right outside my window, their silhouette visible against the faint glow of the streetlight behind them. They weren't moving, just standing there, looking in, watching me through the glass. I froze, couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything except stare at that shape and feel my heart trying to pound its way out of my chest. The figure was motionless, patient, like they'd been there for a while, like they'd been waiting. The shadow shifted slightly, and I saw an arm rise, slow and deliberate, holding something up to the window. A phone. The screen was bright in the darkness, and even from across the room, I could see what was on it. An alarm, set for 3:33 a.m., and below it, a single word I couldn't quite read, but somehow already knew. Watching. I called 911 before I could think about whether I was overreacting. Crouched behind my couch with the phone pressed to my ear, whispering to the dispatcher about the figure in my window. Well, the alarm, the word on the screen. She told me to stay where I was, stay on the line, that officers were on their way. I did what she said, didn't move, didn't look at the window again, just stayed low and tried to control my breathing while the minutes stretched into something that felt like hours. By the time the police arrived, the figure was gone. They searched the window wells, the alley behind my building, the small patch of yard that separated my apartment from the street. Nothing. No footprints in the mud, no cigarette butts or discarded items, no evidence that anyone had been standing outside my window at 3:33 in the morning. One of the officers suggested I might have seen a shadow, a trick of the light, my own reflection distorted by the glass. He said it kindly, the way you talk to someone who's clearly shaken, but probably imagining things. I didn't argue with him, didn't tell him about the phone screen I'd seen, the alarm time that matched mine, the word that had glowed in the darkness. They would have thought I was crazy. Maybe I was starting to wonder that myself. The officers gave me a case number and told me to call if anything else happened. They were professional, thorough in their own way, but I could see they didn't think this was anything serious. A nervous guy in a basement apartment, spooked by shadows in the night. It probably wasn't the strangest call they'd responded to that week. I didn't sleep for the rest of that night. Sat on my couch with every light on, watching those windows like they might shatter at any moment. When dawn finally came, gray and cold through the glass, I felt something loosen in my chest. Daylight made everything seem more manageable. Daylight made it possible to believe I'd overreacted, misinterpreted, seen something that wasn't really there. Then I checked my phone and found the text message. It was from an unknown number, sent at exactly 3:34 a.m., 1 minute after the alarm had gone off. The message was simple, just 3 words that made my blood turn to ice. "Did you see?" I stared at that message for a long time, my hands trembling, my mind racing through explanations that didn't exist. Someone had been outside my window. Someone had set off my alarm remotely somehow, and then texted me to make sure I'd noticed. This wasn't a glitch, or a coincidence, or my imagination. This was deliberate. This was targeted. Someone was doing this to me specifically, and they wanted me to know it. I took the phone to work and showed Ramirez the message. His expression changed when he saw it. That casual dismissiveness from before, replaced by something more serious. He took my phone to the back room and spent an hour going through it, checking for spyware, remote access apps, anything that could explain how someone might be controlling my alarms from the outside. When he came back, his face was grim. "There's something on here," he said. "Buried deep. It's not showing up in your normal app list, but it's running in the background, sending and receiving data. Someone installed this on your phone without you knowing. Could have been physical access. Did you ever leave it somewhere? Lend it to anyone?" I thought back over the past few months, trying to remember any moment when my phone had been out of my sight. There had been a party in September, a friend of a friend's place where I'd left my jacket on a pile with my phone in the pocket. There had been a date in October that hadn't gone anywhere, a woman I'd met through an app who'd seemed distracted the whole time, who'd excused herself to the bathroom while my phone sat on the table. There had been dozens of moments, hundreds, because I'd never thought I needed to guard my phone like it was something valuable, like it was something someone might want to compromise. "Can you remove it?" I asked. "I can try, but whoever did this knows what they're doing. This isn't some off-the-shelf spyware you download from a sketchy website. This is sophisticated." Ramirez looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You need to go to the police again. Show them the message. Tell them someone's been stalking you. This is serious, Grant." I went back to the police that afternoon with screenshots, with Ramirez's findings, with everything I could think of that might convince them this was real. The detective who took my statement was more attentive than the officers from the night before, but I could still see the skepticism underneath his professional concern. Stalking cases were hard to prove, he explained, without a clear suspect, without physical evidence, without a pattern of behavior they could document. There wasn't much they could do except file a report and suggest I change my phone number. I changed my number, changed my phone entirely, bought a new one with cash from a store I'd never been to before. Didn't transfer any of my data, didn't log into any of my old accounts, started completely fresh with a device no one could have tampered with. The alarm went off at 3:33 a.m. the next night. I lay in the dark, listening to that familiar chime coming from my brand new phone, and I understood something I'd been trying not to face. This wasn't about the phone. It never had been. Whoever was doing this had access to something else, something beyond the device in my hand. They knew where I lived. They knew my number before I knew it myself. They were inside my life in ways I couldn't see or protect against. And when I looked toward the window well, already knowing what I'd find, the shadow was there again, watching, waiting. This time, they waved. I moved out of that apartment the next day, didn't pack properly, didn't worry about the lease, just threw everything I could fit into my car and drove to a motel on the other side of the city, paid cash for a week, gave them a fake name, sat in that beige room with its stained carpet and its smell of industrial cleaner, and I tried to convince myself that whoever was doing this couldn't follow me here, that I'd broken the chain, escaped the pattern, left them standing in an empty window well with no one to watch. The alarm went off at 3:33 a.m. I threw the phone across the room, heard it hit the wall and clatter to the floor, that chime still playing, still filling the silence with its cheerful insistence. When I finally retrieved it, hands shaking, I found a new text from that same unknown number. "Nice room. Smells better than the last one." They were here. Wherever here was, however far I ran, they were already there, watching, following, knowing things they shouldn't know, seeing things they couldn't see. I checked every corner of that motel room, checked the bathroom, the closet, the space under the bed. Nothing. No cameras, no devices, no explanation for how they could know what my room smelled like. I didn't sleep. Just sat in the chair by the window with the curtains drawn, watching the door, waiting for a knock that never came. By morning, I'd made a decision. I couldn't run from someone I couldn't see. I needed to find out who they were, what they wanted, why they'd chosen me out of everyone in the world to torment. There had to be a connection somewhere, a thread I could pull that would unravel this whole nightmare. I started with the obvious, the people who'd had access to my phone, The party in September had been hosted by a coworker named Mitchell, a guy I'd known casually for about a year. I called him that morning, asked if he remembered anything unusual from that night, anyone paying too much attention to me or my belongings. He didn't. Said the party had been pretty standard, nothing weird, definitely no one lurking around the coat pile. But when I asked for a guest list, he went quiet for a moment before telling me he'd have to think about it. Said some people had shown up who weren't really invited, friends of friends he didn't know. He'd send me what he could remember. The date in October was harder to trace. I'd met her through an app. Her profile name was Elise, though she'd told me in person her name was actually Elena. We'd had drinks at a bar downtown, made awkward conversation for an hour, and parted ways with a vague promise to do it again that neither of us followed up on. I'd deleted the app months ago, and I couldn't remember which one it had been. Couldn't remember much about her either, except that she'd been pretty in a forgettable way, with dark hair and pale eyes that hadn't quite met mine when we talked. I tried to find her anyway. Spent hours searching through the apps I might have used, looking for profiles that matched my hazy memory. Nothing. Either she'd deleted her account or I was looking in the wrong places. Or she'd never been real to begin with. Just a persona. A mask worn by someone who wanted access to my phone and my life. Mitchell's list arrived that afternoon. A text message with about 20 names and a note that said, "This is everyone I can remember. Sorry it's not more helpful." I didn't recognize most of them, but I started searching anyway, pulling up social media profiles and LinkedIn pages and anything else I could find. Most of them seemed normal. Coworkers, friends of coworkers, the usual assortment of people who show up at parties without really being invited. But one name caught my attention, Victor Marsh. I didn't know anyone named Victor Marsh. Had never heard the name before, couldn't find it in any of my contacts or messages or memories. But when I searched for him online, I found almost nothing. No social media, no public records. Just a single LinkedIn profile with no photo and a job description that read, Independent Consultant. The profile had been created 2 months before Mitchell's party and hadn't been updated since. It looked fake. It looked like exactly the kind of digital identity someone would create if they wanted to exist just enough to get into a party, just enough to get close to someone's coat pile and the phone hidden inside. I sent Mitchell a message asking about Victor Marsh. Who had invited him? How did he know anyone at the party? What did he look like? Mitchell's response came 3 hours later, just 2 sentences that made my blood run cold. I don't remember anyone named Victor Marsh. Are you sure that name was on my list? I checked the message he'd sent me, scrolled through the names one by one, looking for the one I'd seen clearly just hours before. It wasn't there. The name had vanished, like it had never existed at all. My phone buzzed with a new text from the unknown number. I stared at the notification for a long moment before opening it, already knowing it would be something I didn't want to see. Getting warmer, Grant. But you're looking in the wrong direction. Below the text was a photo. It took me a moment to understand what I was seeing. The angle was strange, the lighting dim. Then it clicked into focus, and my stomach dropped through the floor. It was a picture of me, sitting in this motel room, taken from somewhere above me, looking down, capturing the top of my head and the phone in my hands and the bed behind me where I'd thrown my bag. I looked up at the ceiling, at the smoke detector with its small dark lens, at the tiny hole I'd never noticed, no bigger than a pinhead, positioned directly above the chair where I'd been sitting for hours. They weren't following me. They were already everywhere I went, already watching before I even arrived, and I was only now beginning to understand how deep this went. I left the motel within the hour, didn't check out properly, just grabbed my bag and walked out to my car in the parking lot, scanning the rooftops and windows and every shadow that might hide a camera or a person or whatever else was tracking me through my life. The afternoon sun was bright and cold, the kind of winter light that makes everything look sharp-edged and exposed. I felt naked in it, felt like I was being watched by 1,000 eyes I couldn't see. I drove without a destination, just moving, trying to think. The cameras in the motel room meant this wasn't one person with a grudge. This was infrastructure, equipment that had been installed before I'd ever walked through that door, placed by someone who either owned the building or had access to its hidden spaces. That kind of setup took money, planning, resources. That kind of setup didn't happen because someone had a bad date or got snubbed at a party. This was something else, something bigger, and I was only one small piece of it. I ended up at Ramirez's apartment, knocking on his door at 4 p.m. without calling ahead. He opened it with a beer in his hand and a confused expression that shifted to concern when he saw my face. I told him everything: the motel, the photos, the camera in the ceiling, the name that had vanished from the guest list. He listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker with every detail. "This sounds like organized stalking," he said when I finished. "Gang stalking, some people call it. Multiple people coordinating to harass a single target. It's rare, but it happens. Usually it's paranoid delusion, but..." He trailed off, looking at the phone in my hand like it might bite him. "You have evidence. You have photos. This is real. Who does something like this?" My voice cracked on the question. Who has the resources to put cameras in motel rooms and hack phones and make names disappear from text messages? Why would anyone do this to me? Ramirez was quiet for a moment, thinking. "There are groups online," he said slowly. "Dark web communities that do this for entertainment. They pick targets, random people sometimes, or people who catch their attention for whatever reason, and they make their lives hell. They call it the game. The more you react, the more points they score. The goal is to drive you crazy, make you look paranoid, isolate you from everyone who might help. The game." I thought about the texts, the playful tone underneath the menace. "Getting warmer. Nice room. Did you see?" It did feel like a game, like I was a mouse being batted around by a cat that wasn't hungry, just bored. "How do I make it stop?" Ramirez shook his head. "I don't know. These people are good at what they do. They stay anonymous, they cover their tracks, and they've got more patience than you can imagine. Some of them have been running the same targets for years." He met my eyes, and I saw something there I didn't want to see. Pity. The best thing you can do is not react. Don't engage. Don't investigate. Don't show them you're scared. Eventually they get bored and move on to someone else. I stayed at Ramirez's that night, sleeping on his couch with the lights on and his reassurances echoing in my head. Don't react. Don't engage. Let them get bored. It sounded reasonable in theory, the kind of advice a therapist might give about dealing with bullies, but these weren't bullies. These were people who'd installed cameras in my motel room, who'd hacked my phone across multiple devices, who knew where I was before I knew it myself. At 3:33 a.m., my alarm went off. I silenced it without looking at the screen. Lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. Don't engage. Don't show them you're scared. Ramirez was snoring softly in his bedroom down the hall, oblivious to the chime that had pulled me out of the first real sleep I'd had in days. My phone buzzed with a text. I didn't look at it. It buzzed again and again and again, a steady rhythm of notifications that vibrated against my chest like a second heartbeat. I kept my eyes on the ceiling, my jaw clenched, my hands fisted at my sides. They wanted me to look. They wanted me to react. I wouldn't give them that. Then I heard the sound from the kitchen. A drawer opening, soft, careful, the sound of someone trying not to be heard. Then footsteps, not Ramirez's heavy shuffle, but something lighter, more deliberate. The creak of a floorboard, the whisper of fabric against a wall. Someone was in the apartment. I sat up slowly, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my teeth. The living room was dark, except for the streetlight filtering through the blinds, casting bars of pale light across the floor. The kitchen doorway was a black rectangle at the edge of my vision, impenetrable, hiding whatever had made that sound. I thought about calling out to Ramirez, thought about running for the front door, Thought about grabbing my phone and calling 911, doing all the things a rational person would do when they heard an intruder in the night. But I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, could only sit there, frozen, as a figure stepped out of the kitchen and into the dim light of the living room. It was a woman. Dark hair, pale eyes, a face I almost recognized from a memory I'd tried to forget. She was holding something in her hand. My phone, I realized with a sick lurch. She'd taken it from beside me while I lay there pretending not to care. "Hello, Grant," she said. Her voice was soft, almost friendly, the voice of someone making small talk at a party. "You've been looking for me. I thought it was time we finally met. Elena, Elise, whatever her real name was." She smiled, and in the glow of my phone's screen, I could see her pale eyes clearly for the first time. They weren't just watching me anymore. They were deciding what to do with me. She moved closer, and I scrambled backward on the couch, my legs tangling in the blanket I'd been sleeping under. There was nowhere to go. The front door was behind her, the windows were locked, and Ramirez was down the hall, sleeping through whatever was about to happen to me. Elena, if that was even her name, watched my panic with an expression of mild amusement, like I was a bug doing something entertaining before she crushed it. "Don't bother screaming," she said. "Your friend took something in his beer. He'll sleep through anything for the next few hours." She tilted her head, studying me. "You've been more fun than most of them. Most people give up after the first week. Stop sleeping, stop eating, check themselves into hospitals or run back to their parents. But you kept trying to figure it out. I respect that. What do you want?" My voice was barely a whisper. "Why me? Why anyone?" She shrugged, a casual gesture that made the whole thing seem even more horrifying. "You were convenient. You left your phone unattended at that party and I was bored. That's all it takes, really. One moment of carelessness, and you become ours." She smiled again, and there was nothing human in it. "We've been running you for 2 months now, watching you try to solve it, try to escape. You've given us so much good content. The word hit me like a slap. You're filming this, all of it. For what? Entertainment? There's a market for everything, Grant. You'd be surprised how many people will pay to watch someone fall apart in real time. The fear, the paranoia, the slow erosion of everything they thought was real." She stepped closer, close enough that I could smell her perfume. Something floral and expensive, completely at odds with the horror she was describing. "Usually, this is where we'd move to the final phase, push you over the edge completely, but you've been so determined to survive that we thought we'd try something different." "What does that mean?" She held up my phone, the screen still glowing with unread messages. "It means you have a choice. You can keep running, keep fighting, keep trying to expose us, and we'll make your life so unbearable that you'll beg for it to end, or you can accept that this is your life now. Go back to work, go back to your routine, and pretend none of this ever happened. We'll still be watching. We'll always be watching. But we'll let you live." The choice wasn't really a choice. I knew that, even as she laid it out for me. There was no scenario where I won, no path that led to freedom or justice or any kind of normal existence. I was trapped in their game, and the only question was how much I was willing to suffer before I accepted it. Something shifted in the hallway behind her. A shadow, a presence, a figure that materialized out of the darkness with a speed I didn't expect. Ramirez, awake after all, moving with the quiet precision of someone who'd spent years in situations more dangerous than IT support. He had something in his hand, something heavy, and before Elena could turn around, he brought it down on the back of her head with a sound I'll never forget. She dropped, without a word, just crumpled, my phone clattering from her hand, her body folding onto the floor like someone had cut her strings. Ramirez stood over her, breathing hard, the baseball bat in his hand trembling slightly. "I only drank half the beer," he said. "Something tasted off." The next few hours were a blur of police and paramedics and questions I couldn't answer coherently. Elena, her real name was Catherine Park, according to the ID in her pocket, was arrested for breaking and entering, though I knew the charges would eventually be much more serious. The police found equipment in her car that connected her to surveillance operations across 3 states. They found hard drives full of footage, message logs, financial records showing payments from accounts that traced back to servers in countries that didn't cooperate with American law enforcement. She was part of something larger, exactly like Ramirez had warned me. A network of people who did this for money, for entertainment, for reasons I still don't fully understand. Catherine was one node in a web that stretched across the country and beyond, and even with her in custody, the rest of them were still out there, still watching, still playing the game with targets who didn't know they'd been chosen. The investigation took months. I testified 3 times, gave depositions, sat through interviews with federal agents who seemed both fascinated and horrified by what had been done to me. They caught a few more members of the network, shut down some of their infrastructure, but they were honest with me about the limitations. These people were careful, they were patient, and for everyone they caught, there were dozens more they'd never find. I moved to a different city after the trial, changed my name legally, changed my appearance as much as I could without surgery, got a job doing something completely different, something that didn't involve technology, that let me work with my hands instead of screens. I don't own a smartphone anymore. Haven't for 2 years. I use a flip phone that can't run apps, can't connect to the internet, can't do anything except make calls and send texts. It still goes off sometimes. At 3:33 a.m., that simple default ringtone cutting through the silence of my apartment. There's never a call on the other end when I answer. Just breathing, soft and patient, and then a click as they hang up. I've stopped trying to trace the calls, stopped trying to understand how they're still reaching me, still finding me, still reminding me that I'll never really be free. Some games don't end just because you stop playing. Some games don't have an exit, no matter how far you run or how completely you try to disappear. I sleep with the lights on now, check the corners of every room I enter, look for the pinhole cameras that might be watching. I don't trust anyone new, don't make friends, don't go on dates. My life has become a small, controlled thing, manageable, survivable, but hollow in ways I can't explain to anyone who hasn't lived through something like this. And every night, just before I close my eyes, I check my phone one last time, making sure there are no alarms set for times I never chose. There never are, but that doesn't mean they won't be there tomorrow. That's the thing about being hunted. Even when the hunters go quiet, you never really stop running. Story 3, the billboard, showing a photo of my house. I saw it on my way to get groceries, and I almost drove off the road. The billboard stood at the intersection of Route 9 and Millers Creek Road, about 3 miles from my house. It had been advertising a personal injury lawyer for as long as I'd lived in Carver's Mill. Some guy in a cheap suit pointing at the camera with the words, "Injured, call now," plastered across his chest. I'd driven past it hundreds of times without really seeing it. That's how billboards work. They become part of the landscape, invisible until they're not. But this morning, the lawyer was gone. And in his place was a photograph of my house. Not a house that looked like mine. My house. The pale blue siding I'd painted myself last summer. The crooked mailbox I kept meaning to fix. The oak tree in the front yard with the tire swing I'd hung for my nephew's visits. Every detail was exact, captured in high resolution and blown up to 30 feet across, impossible to miss from the road. I pulled onto the shoulder and sat there with the engine running, staring at that billboard like it might change if I looked long enough. Cars passed behind me, their drivers probably glancing at the same image, seeing my home displayed for the whole county to see. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel. My chest felt tight in a way that had nothing to do with the seatbelt. My name is Nora Pemberton. I was 34 that spring, living alone in a farmhouse I'd bought 3 years earlier with money from my divorce settlement. I'd moved to Carver's Mill specifically because nobody knew me here, because I could disappear into the kind of anonymous rural life that doesn't ask questions or demand explanations. The house was a mile off the main road, surrounded by fields and forest, visible only if you drove all the way up the long gravel driveway. I'd chosen it for the privacy, for the feeling that, for the first time in my adult life, I could exist without being watched. And now my house was on a billboard, 30 feet tall, displayed for every person who drove through this intersection. I got out of the car and walked closer, my legs unsteady beneath me. The photograph had been taken from the driveway. That much was clear from the angle. Whoever shot it had been standing right where I parked my car every day, pointing a camera at my front door like they had every right to be there. The image was crisp, professional quality, the kind of thing you'd see in a real estate listing, except there was no text, no phone number, no explanation of what it was advertising. Just my house, silent and exposed. I called the billboard company that afternoon, after I'd driven home and locked every door and checked every window and sat in my kitchen trying to convince myself this was some kind of mistake. The woman who answered sounded bored until I explained what I was looking at, and then her voice shifted into something more careful. "That's not possible," she said. "Our billboards are booked months in advance. That location is contracted through August for Brennan and Associates, the personal injury firm. Whatever you're seeing, it's not something we authorized." "I'm looking at it right now," I said. I'd driven back to the intersection after making the call, parked on the shoulder again, unable to stay away. It's a photograph of a house. My house. There's no text, no branding, nothing, just the image. She put me on hold for several minutes. When she came back, her voice had an edge to it. "I've contacted our maintenance team. They're going to check on the location this afternoon. In the meantime, I'd suggest you file a police report. If someone tampered with our billboard without authorization, that's vandalism. And if it's your house in the photo..." She trailed off, the implication hanging in the silence. The police were less helpful than I'd hoped. Officer Kendrick was polite but clearly skeptical, taking notes on my statement while glancing at me with the expression people get when they think you're wasting their time. Yes, he'd send someone to look at the billboard. Yes, he'd file a report. No, there wasn't much they could do unless there was an explicit threat or evidence of a crime beyond unauthorized use of the billboard space. "Could be a prank," he suggested. "You make any enemies recently? Ex-husband, maybe?" I hadn't spoken to Daniel in over 2 years, and even at his worst, he'd never been creative enough for something like this. Our marriage had ended in mutual exhaustion, not hatred. He'd moved to Seattle with his new girlfriend, and the last I'd heard, he was happy. This wasn't him. I didn't know who it was. That was the part that kept circling through my mind as I drove home that evening, watching my rearview mirror like someone might be following. The photograph had been taken from my driveway. That meant someone had been on my property, had stood where I stood every day, had looked at my house with a camera in their hands. And then they'd gone to the trouble of putting that image on a billboard, of making sure everyone in Carver's Mill could see exactly where Nora Pemberton lived. That night, I didn't sleep. Just sat in my living room with the lights off, watching the driveway through the front window, waiting for headlights that never came. The house felt different now, exposed, violated, like the walls had become transparent and anyone could see right through them. I'd moved here to be invisible, to be safe, and someone had decided to put my hiding place on display for the whole world. Around 3 a.m., my phone buzzed with a notification, an email from an address I didn't recognize, just a string of random numbers at a domain I'd never heard of. The subject line was empty. The body of the email contained only 2 sentences. "Did you like the first one? Wait until you see what comes next." I stared at that message until the screen went dark, my reflection staring back at me in the black glass. This wasn't a prank. This was a promise. The second billboard appeared 2 days later. This one was on the other side of town, near the elementary school on Whitmore Avenue. Same format. No text, no branding, just a photograph blown up to massive scale. But this image wasn't of my house from the outside. It was taken through my kitchen window, showing the interior in sharp detail. My coffee maker on the counter, my calendar on the wall, the dish rack where I'd left my breakfast plate to dry. Someone had been outside my house at night, close enough to press a camera lens against the glass, and I'd never known they were there. I found out about it from Mrs. Patterson at the post office. She mentioned it casually, the way you mention weather or traffic, not realizing she was describing my kitchen to my face. "Strangest thing," she said. "Just a picture of somebody's kitchen. No idea what it's supposed to mean. Figured it was some kind of art project, maybe." I drove to Whitmore Avenue and sat in my car, staring up at my own kitchen displayed for every parent dropping off their kids, every teacher arriving for work, every person in this town who might wonder whose home they were looking at. The angle of the photograph told me exactly where the person had stood, behind the rhododendron bush at the corner of my house, the spot where shadows pooled deepest after sunset. They'd been patient, they'd been careful, and they'd gotten exactly the shot they wanted. I bought cameras that afternoon, 4 of them, wireless, motion activated, the kind that sent alerts to your phone whenever something moved within their range. I spent the evening mounting them at the corners of my property, pointing at the driveway, the backyard, the windows where someone had stood and photographed my private life. My hands were steady while I worked, but inside I felt like something was unraveling, some essential thread that had been holding me together since I'd moved to this place. The cameras didn't catch anything that first night, just deer moving through the backfield, a raccoon investigating my trash cans, the ordinary wildlife of rural living. I watched the feeds obsessively, checking my phone every few minutes, waiting for the alert that would tell me someone was out there. Nothing came. The house sat silent in the darkness, and I sat silent inside it, 2 things waiting for something neither of us could name. The 3rd billboard went up on Friday morning, and this time it wasn't just my house, it was me. The photograph showed me standing at my bedroom window, silhouetted against the light, clearly visible from the waist up. I was wearing the old t-shirt I slept in, my hair loose around my shoulders, my face turned toward something outside the frame. I remembered that moment, 2 nights ago, when I'd heard a sound in the yard and gone to the window to check. I'd stood there for maybe 30 seconds, looking out at nothing, seeing nothing, before going back to bed. Someone had been in my yard, watching me, photographing me, and my brand new cameras hadn't caught a thing. I went to the police again, this time with printouts of all 3 billboards and the email I'd received. Officer Kendrick wasn't smiling anymore. He looked at the photographs with an expression I recognized from my years of marriage, the face of someone who's realized they're in over their head and doesn't want to admit it. "We'll increase patrols in your area," he said, "and I'd recommend you stay with someone else for a while, a friend, a family member, anyone, until we figure out what's going on." I didn't have anyone. That was the whole point of moving to Carver's Mill. I'd wanted to be alone, wanted to shed the complications of a life that had become too heavy to carry. My parents were gone. My sister lived in London. The friends I'd had before the divorce had drifted away during the ugly parts, and I'd never bothered to replace them. There was no one to call, no safe harbor to retreat to, just me and my farmhouse and whoever was turning my solitude into a public spectacle. I started sleeping during the day when sunlight made the cameras more useful, and the idea of someone watching felt less suffocating. At night, I'd sit in the dark with all the lights off, moving from room to room, never staying in one place long enough to be framed in a window. It was exhausting, paranoid, the kind of behavior I'd once associated with people who'd lost touch with reality. But reality had become something I couldn't trust anymore. The walls of my house were transparent now, and everyone in Carver's Mill could see right through them. The emails kept coming, never from the same address, never with enough information to trace. They were brief, almost playful, like notes passed in class by someone who knew they wouldn't get caught. "You look tired. The blue shirt suits you. You should lock the basement window. Anyone could get in." That last one sent me down to the basement with a hammer and nails, boarding up the window I'd never thought to secure because it was too small for a person to fit through. But was it? I stared at the frame, trying to calculate dimensions, trying to imagine someone squeezing through that narrow opening into the dark space beneath my home. The thought made my skin crawl in ways I couldn't articulate. I started making lists of everyone I'd interacted with since moving here. The cashiers at the grocery store, the mechanic who'd fixed my car last winter, the mail carrier, the propane delivery guy, the teenager who'd mowed my lawn a few times before I'd started doing it myself. Carver's Mill was small, maybe 3,000 people, and I'd kept to myself as much as possible. Whoever was doing this either knew me from before, or they'd chosen me for reasons I couldn't understand. On Saturday night, exactly 1 week after the first billboard appeared, I got a different kind of email. No text this time, just an image attachment. I opened it against my better judgment. The photograph showed the inside of my bedroom. My bed, my nightstand, my reading lamp. The angle was wrong though, not from a window, not from the doorway. It had been taken from inside my closet, looking out through the slats, capturing the room from a vantage point that meant only one thing. Someone had been inside my house, hiding, waiting, watching me sleep from 3 feet away, and I had no idea when. I searched the house that night with a knife in one hand and my phone in the other. Every closet, every cabinet, every space large enough to hide a human body. I checked behind the water heater in the basement, inside the crawl space above the hallway ceiling, under beds and behind furniture and in corners I hadn't looked at since the day I'd moved in. I found dust, cobwebs, a dead mouse behind the refrigerator. Nothing else. No one crouching in the shadows, no evidence of how they'd gotten in or where they'd hidden. But someone had been in my closet. Someone had stood 3 feet from where I slept and photographed me through the slats. And I'd never heard them, never sensed them, never woken up to the presence of another human being breathing in my bedroom. The violation of it was so complete that I couldn't process it properly. My brain kept sliding off the reality like water off glass, refusing to accept what had happened in my own home. I called a locksmith the next morning and had every lock in the house replaced. New deadbolts, new window latches, a chain for the front door that I secured every night like a ritual. I bought motion sensor lights for the yard, installed an alarm system that would scream if anyone opened a door or window without the code. I turned my farmhouse into a fortress, and none of it made me feel safe. Because whoever was doing this had already proven they could get past locks and cameras and every defense I could think of. They were always one step ahead, always watching, always waiting for me to let my guard down. The fourth billboard appeared on a rainy Tuesday, and this time everyone in Carver's Mill knew whose house they'd been looking at. It showed my face in close-up, not through a window, not from a distance, but inches away, like the photographer had been standing right in front of me. My eyes were closed. My lips were slightly parted. I was asleep, and someone had leaned over my bed and captured my face with the intimacy of a lover. Beneath the image, for the first time, there was text. Just my name and address, printed in clean white letters for the whole town to see. Nora Pemberton, 4481, County Road 12. My phone started ringing within an hour. Neighbors I'd never spoken to calling to ask if I was okay. The woman from the billboard company apologizing profusely, promising they were investigating. Officer Kendrick, his voice tight with something that might have been fear, telling me they were sending a car to my house and I shouldn't go anywhere until it arrived. I didn't wait for the car. I couldn't stay in that house another minute. Couldn't stand the thought of whoever was doing this watching me through one of my own windows while I waited for help that might never come. I threw clothes in a bag and drove to the only place I could think of, a motel 40 miles outside of town, a place I'd passed on the highway but never had reason to stop. I paid cash, gave a fake name, and sat on the bed with the curtains drawn and the door triple locked, trying to remember how to breathe. The emails found me anyway. Running won't help. I know where you are. Then, an hour later, room 14, second floor. The ice machine makes a sound every 30 minutes. Doesn't that drive you crazy? I was in room 14. The ice machine was directly outside my door. I could hear it cycling even as I read the message. that mechanical hum that happened like clockwork every 30 minutes, exactly like they'd said. I left the motel and drove for 3 hours, ending up in a town I didn't know, a place I'd chosen by pointing randomly at a map. I found another motel, another cash transaction, another locked door between me and whoever was turning my life into a horror show. For 2 days, nothing happened. No emails, no photographs, no billboards with my face plastered across them. I started to let myself hope that distance had broken whatever connection they had, that I'd finally found a place they couldn't reach. On the 3rd day, I got a package. The front desk clerk brought it to my room, a small cardboard box with no return address, just my name written in neat handwriting. I stared at it for a long time before opening it, some part of me knowing that whatever was inside would change everything, would take this nightmare to a place I couldn't come back from. Inside the box was a photograph and a note. The photograph showed me sitting in this very room, on this very bed, reading something on my phone. It had been taken through the window. The curtains I'd thought were closed had a gap I hadn't noticed, a sliver of visibility that had been enough. Beneath the photograph were the words I'd been dreading since this whole thing began. I can find you anywhere, Nora. You can't run from someone who's already inside your life. Come home. It's time we talked. There was something else in the box, nestled beneath the note. A key, old brass, the kind that might fit a farmhouse door from another era. I recognized it immediately. It was the key I'd found in a kitchen drawer when I first moved in, the one the previous owners must have left behind. I'd tossed it in a junk drawer and forgotten about it. Someone had been in my house long enough to go through my drawers, long enough to find a meaningless key and save it for a moment like this, long enough to learn everything about my life, my routines, my fears, and now they wanted me to come home. The rational part of my brain screamed at me to go to the police, to show them the package, to demand protection I wasn't sure they could provide. But another part, the part that was exhausted from running, from hiding, from being the mouse in someone else's game, that part was tired of not knowing, tired of shadows and emails and photographs taken by hands I couldn't see. If they wanted to talk, then we would talk. On my terms, in my house, with whatever weapon I could find and whatever courage I could scrape together from the ruins of my former life. I checked out of the motel and started driving home. The rain had started again, streaking across my windshield, drumming on the roof of my car like fingers tapping against glass. Patient, insistent, waiting. I arrived at my house just after dark, the rain still falling in steady sheets that turned my headlights into pale smears against the night. The driveway looked the same as always, gravel and mud, the oak tree with its tire swing swaying slightly in the wind, the farmhouse sitting silent and watchful at the end of the path. My security lights flicked on as I approached, illuminating the yard in harsh white, and for a moment I let myself hope that I'd find everything normal, that whoever had been tormenting me had lost interest, moved on, left me alone to pick up the pieces of my shattered sense of safety. Then I saw the front door standing open. I parked at the edge of the driveway, leaving my headlights on, their beams cutting through the rain toward that dark rectangle where my door should have been closed and locked. The alarm system I'd installed wasn't making a sound. Either it had been disabled or it had never been triggered in the first place. I sat in my car for a long moment, my hands gripping the steering wheel, watching that open doorway for any sign of movement. Nothing, just darkness and rain and the invitation I'd been given. I had a crowbar in my trunk, left over from a fencing project I'd never finished. I retrieved it now, the weight of it solid and reassuring in my hands. Then I walked toward my own front door like I was approaching a stranger's house, every step measured, every sense straining for warning signs I might have missed. The interior was dark. I reached for the light switch just inside the door, flipped it, and nothing happened. The power was out. Cut, probably, or disabled at the breaker box. I pulled out my phone and used its flashlight instead, the beam sweeping across my living room, my kitchen, the hallway that led to my bedroom. Everything looked the same as when I'd left. Furniture in place, nothing disturbed, no obvious signs of intrusion except for the door that had been locked and was now open. "I know you're here." My voice sounded strange in the silence, too loud and too small at the same time. "You wanted to talk, so let's talk." For a moment, nothing happened. The house held its breath around me, the rain drumming on the roof the only sound. Then a voice came from the darkness of the hallway, calm and measured, a voice I almost recognized. "I was starting to think you wouldn't come back." A figure stepped into the edge of my phone's light. A woman, maybe a few years older than me, with sharp features and dark hair cut short. She was dressed practically, jeans, a dark sweater, boots that looked made for walking through fields and climbing through windows. Her hands were empty, held loosely at her sides, but something about her posture suggested she didn't need a weapon to be dangerous. "Who are you?" I kept the crowbar raised, my body angled toward the door in case I needed to run. "Why are you doing this to me?" She tilted her head, studying me with an expression I couldn't read. "You really don't remember, do you?" I wondered about that. Whether you'd blocked it out, or whether you genuinely didn't know. "I've never seen you before in my life." "No, but you knew my brother." She stepped closer, and I stepped back, maintaining the distance between us. "Michael Vance. You worked with him at Hartley and Associates in Chicago. 6 years ago, before your divorce, before you ran away to play farmer in the middle of nowhere." The name hit me like cold water. Michael Vance. Quiet, awkward, the kind of coworker you forgot about the moment he left the room. He'd worked in accounting while I was in marketing, and our paths had barely crossed except in meetings and the occasional break room encounter. I remembered him vaguely, a face in a crowd of faces from a life I'd tried to leave behind. "I barely knew him," I said. "We worked in different departments. I don't understand what this has to do with—" "You filed a complaint against him." Her voice had changed, something harder underneath the calm. "Sexual harassment. Said he made you uncomfortable. Said he was always watching you, always finding reasons to be near your desk. You ruined his career, Nora. He lost his job, his reputation, everything he'd worked for, because you were uncomfortable." I remembered now. The way he'd lingered near my office, the emails that were slightly too personal, the feeling of being watched that had made my skin crawl. I'd gone to HR because I'd felt unsafe, because the company had policies for exactly that kind of situation. I'd done what I was supposed to do. He killed himself 3 months later. The woman's voice was steady, but I could see something breaking behind her eyes. Couldn't find work, couldn't face anyone, couldn't live with what you'd done to him. And you just moved on. New city, new life, new name. Like he never existed. I felt the weight of her words settle over me, heavy and cold. I hadn't known about Michael's death, hadn't thought about him at all since leaving that job, since leaving Chicago, since rebuilding myself into someone new. He'd been a problem I'd solved and then forgotten, a footnote in a chapter I'd closed. "I'm sorry about your brother." I kept my voice even, kept the crowbar raised. "I didn't know. But what he did wasn't okay, and reporting it wasn't wrong. I had a right to feel safe at my job." "Safe?" She laughed, a harsh sound that echoed through the dark house. "You wanted to feel safe. So you destroyed someone's life over a few awkward conversations and some emails. And now I've spent the last 3 years making sure you understand what it really feels like to be watched, to be hunted, to have no privacy, no peace, no escape." 3 years. She'd been planning this for 3 years, long before I'd even found this house. The realization made my stomach drop. This wasn't random. It was calculated, methodical, the patient work of someone who'd had nothing but time and grief and hatred to fuel them. "What happens now?" I asked. "You've made your point. You've taken everything from me. What else is there?" She smiled, and the warmth in it was worse than any threat. Now we see how long you last. Michael made it 3 months. Let's find out if you're stronger than he was." She moved before I could react, faster than I'd expected, and the lights in the house suddenly blazed back to life, blinding after so long in the dark. By the time my vision cleared, she was gone. The front door stood open to the rain, and I was alone in my bright, exposed house, surrounded by windows that suddenly felt like eyes. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A new email from a new address. Day 1 begins now. I didn't give her 3 months. I didn't give her 3 days. The morning after our confrontation, I drove to the county sheriff's office and told them everything. Showed them the emails, the photographs, explained the connection to Michael Vance and his sister. I gave them her description, her approximate age, everything I could remember from those few minutes in my dark living room. The detective who took my statement, a woman named Reyes with tired eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, listened without interrupting, then made a phone call that changed everything. Michael Vance's sister was named Caroline. She'd been on their radar for 2 years, connected to a harassment campaign against another woman in Ohio who'd also filed a complaint against Michael before I had. That woman had moved 4 times trying to escape. She'd lost her job, her marriage, her sense of safety. She'd nearly driven her car off a bridge before checking herself into a psychiatric facility. Caroline had done that to her, systematically, patiently, and she'd never been caught because her victims had been too scared or too broken to fight back. I wasn't going to be the third. The investigation moved faster than I'd expected. Caroline had gotten careless, or maybe she'd gotten arrogant, so confident in her ability to destroy me that she'd stopped covering her tracks. They found her rental car registered under a fake name, traced the billboard payments to a prepaid card she'd purchased with her real ID, recovered emails from servers she'd thought were untraceable. Within a week, they had enough for an arrest warrant. Within 2 weeks, they had her in custody. I testified at her trial 8 months later, sat in that witness box and described every billboard, every email, every night I'd spent staring at my windows wondering if she was out there watching. Caroline watched me from the defense table with the same calm expression she'd worn in my living room, and I made myself meet her eyes. Made myself see her not as a monster, but as a grieving sister who'd let her grief curdle into something monstrous. It didn't make what she'd done okay. It didn't make me forgive her. But it helped me understand that I wasn't the villain in her story, even if she'd needed me to be. She was convicted on 14 counts: stalking, harassment, criminal trespass, conspiracy, and a list of other charges that would keep her in prison for at least 12 years. The woman from Ohio testified too, her voice shaking but determined, finally able to name the person who'd nearly destroyed her life. When the verdict came down, I didn't feel triumph or relief. I just felt tired, hollowed out by months of fear and legal proceedings and the slow work of reclaiming a life that had been taken apart piece by piece. I sold the farmhouse. Couldn't stay there anymore. Couldn't look at those windows without seeing the photographs that had been taken through them. The billboards were long gone, removed within days of my first police report, but the memory of them lingered like a stain I couldn't scrub out. Every time I drove past one of those empty frames, I saw my own face staring back at me, exposed and vulnerable and stripped of every illusion of privacy I'd ever had. I moved to a city this time, a big one, anonymous and crowded, the kind of place where nobody notices you unless you want to be noticed. I found an apartment on the 15th floor of a high-rise, no trees outside the windows, no yard for someone to hide in, no billboards visible from any angle. I got a new job, made new friends, started building something that felt almost like a normal life. But I'm not the same person I was before Caroline Vance decided I deserved to suffer for her brother's death. I check the locks 3 times before bed. I keep my curtains closed even during the day. I don't have social media, don't post photographs online, don't leave any digital breadcrumbs that someone might follow back to my door. The therapist I see every other week says I have PTSD, that the hypervigilance will fade with time, that I'll eventually learn to feel safe again. I want to believe her. Some days, I almost do. I think about Michael Vance sometimes. Not the man who made me uncomfortable at work, but the person he must have been before that. Someone's son, someone's brother, someone who probably never imagined his life would end the way it did. I don't know if my complaint was the only reason he killed himself, or if there were other pressures I never saw, other cracks in a foundation that was already crumbling. I'll never know. And I've had to make peace with that uncertainty, with the possibility that I was both right to protect myself and part of a chain of events that ended in tragedy. That's the thing about consequences. They ripple outward in ways you can't predict, touching lives you never meant to touch, creating pain you never meant to cause. I filed a complaint because I felt unsafe. Michael lost his job because the company believed me. Caroline lost her brother and spent years turning her grief into a weapon. And I lost my sense of security, my home, my belief that the world was a place where doing the right thing kept you safe. None of us got what we deserved. All of us got what we got. I still look at billboards when I drive past them. Can't help it. My eyes go there automatically, scanning for images that don't belong, for photographs that might be mine. I know Caroline is in prison. I know the network she used to torment me has been dismantled. I know rationally that I'm safer now than I've been in years. But late at night, when the city goes quiet and the lights from other apartments flicker across my ceiling like watching eyes, I still wonder about who else might be out there carrying a grudge I don't know about what I might have done years ago that's rippling toward me right now, about whether safety is something you can ever really have or just something you borrow until someone decides to take it away. I keep my curtains closed. I check my locks, and I try not to think about what might be waiting on the other side of the glass, patient and invisible, watching me live a life that doesn't feel entirely mine anymore. Some things, once taken, can never be fully returned. Privacy is one of them. Peace of mind is another. I'm still learning what's left when those things are gone. Story 4. The night security guard with no key card. I noticed him for the first time on a Thursday, around 11 at night, when I was the only person left on the 14th floor. The Whitmore building was one of those glass and steel towers that had gone up in the financial district during the boom years. All sharp angles and open floor plans, and the kind of aggressive modernity that was supposed to make you feel like you were working somewhere important. I'd been there for 2 years, crunching numbers for a wealth management firm that occupied floors 12 through 16. Most of my co-workers cleared out by 7, but I stayed late more often than not. Partly because I was gunning for a promotion, partly because my apartment felt emptier than the office did. The building had good security, keycard access on every door, cameras in every hallway, a team of guards who rotated through the lobby and did rounds on every floor. I knew most of them by sight, if not by name. The older guy with the mustache who always nodded at me, the young woman who'd started a few months back and still seemed nervous about the job. They were fixtures of my late nights, familiar faces in a building that grew strange and quiet after the day shift went home. The guard I saw that Thursday wasn't familiar. He was older, 60s maybe, with a weathered face and gray hair cropped close to his skull. His uniform was the same dark navy as the other guards, but something about it looked wrong. Not dirty, exactly, but worn in a way the others' uniforms never were, like it had been washed too many times and hung to dry in places that didn't get enough sun. He was walking down the hallway toward the elevators when I spotted him through the glass walls of my office, moving with a slow, deliberate pace that seemed out of step with the urgency most guards brought to their rounds. I didn't think much of it at the time. New hires happened. People transferred between buildings. The security company that contracted with Whitmore had dozens of employees I'd never met. I went back to my spreadsheets and forgot about him until I left around midnight, passing through the lobby on my way to the parking garage. He was there again, standing near the security desk, not quite behind it, but close enough that he should have been interacting with the guard on duty, except he wasn't. He was just standing there, watching the elevators, his hands folded in front of him like he was waiting for something. The guard at the desk, A young guy I recognized but couldn't name was looking at his phone and didn't seem to notice the older man at all. I hesitated near the revolving door, something prickling at the back of my neck. The old guard's eyes moved to me, and for a moment we made eye contact across the lobby. His expression didn't change. He just looked at me the way you'd look at furniture, at something that existed in your space but didn't require acknowledgement. Then I pushed through the door and walked to my car and told myself I was being ridiculous. My name is Margot Seo. I was 31 that winter, living alone in an apartment I could barely afford on a salary I was trying to increase. I'd moved to the city 5 years earlier for a job that hadn't worked out, stayed for another job that had, and somewhere along the way, I'd let my life narrow to the width of my office and the commute between it and my bed. I didn't have close friends in the city, didn't have family nearby, didn't have much of anything except the work I'd built my identity around. The Whitmore building was more of a home to me than any place else, and the people in it, even the security guards I barely spoke to, were the closest thing I had to a community. That's why it bothered me that I didn't recognize him. That's why I started paying attention. Over the next 2 weeks, I saw the old guard 6 more times. Always late at night, always alone, always moving through the building with that same slow, deliberate pace. He never acknowledged anyone. Not the other guards, not the cleaning crew, not the handful of late-night workers like me who haunted the upper floors after everyone else went home. He just walked his rounds, floor by floor, passing through doors and down hallways like he'd been doing it for years. But here's the thing that made the hair stand up on the back of my neck, the thing that turned idle curiosity into something closer to dread. I never saw him use his key card, not once. Every door in the Whitmore building required a swipe. It was part of the security protocol, enforced without exception. The system logged every entry, tracked every movement, created a digital record of everyone who passed through every doorway in the building. I'd seen other guards swipe their cards hundreds of times, watched them pause at doors, wait for the beep and the click, move through with the automatic efficiency of people who'd done it so often they didn't think about it anymore. The old guard never paused, never reached for his belt where the key card should have been clipped. He'd approach a door, and the door would simply open, no beep, no click, no delay. Like the building was letting him through. Like he didn't need permission to go wherever he wanted. I told myself there had to be an explanation. Master keys, maybe. Some kind of override system for senior guards that I didn't know about. The building was full of technology I didn't understand, and I was hardly an expert on security protocols. There were 100 reasonable explanations for what I was seeing, but none of them explained why I couldn't find any record of him in the building's employee directory. None of them explained why. When I finally asked the guard at the front desk about the older man who did night rounds, he looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "There's no one here matching that description," he said. "It's just me and Patterson on nights. Has been for months." That was the moment I should have let it go. Should have accepted that I was working too hard, sleeping too little, seeing things that weren't there. Instead, I started looking for answers. The Whitmore building had been standing for almost 40 years. I found that out on my lunch break, scrolling through archived news articles and property records while eating a sandwich at my desk. It had opened in 1986, one of the first major high-rises in this part of the financial district, and had changed hands twice before its current ownership group took over in 2015. The original developer had gone bankrupt in the early 90s. The second owner had sold after a series of structural issues required expensive repairs. Nothing unusual for a building its age, nothing that explained what I'd been seeing. But then I found the article from 1991. It was buried in the archives of a newspaper that didn't exist anymore, digitized as part of some historical preservation project and largely forgotten. The headline was small, unremarkable. Security guard dies in downtown building accident. The story was only 4 paragraphs long. A night security guard named Earl Beckman, 63 years old, had fallen down an elevator shaft in the Whitmore building during his overnight shift. The elevator had malfunctioned, doors opening onto an empty shaft, and Beckman had stepped through without realizing there was nothing beneath him. He'd fallen 14 floors. The building's owners had expressed condolences. An investigation was ongoing. I stared at the screen for a long time, reading those 4 paragraphs over and over. 63 years old, night security guard. The math worked. If Earl Beckman had lived, he'd be in his mid-90s now, too old to be walking rounds in any building. But if the man I'd been seeing was around 60, weathered and gray and wearing a uniform that looked decades out of date, then the timeline didn't match a living person at all. It matched someone who died in 1991 and never left. I tried to find a photograph of Earl Beckman, but the article didn't include one, and I couldn't locate an obituary with any images attached. The security company that had employed him was long gone, absorbed into a larger firm that had no records going back that far. All I had was a name, an age, and a cause of death that made my stomach turn every time I walked past the elevator bank on my floor. That night, I stayed late again. Not for work this time. I'd finished everything that needed finishing by 8 o'clock. I stayed because I wanted to see him, wanted to confirm that what I'd been seeing was real, that I wasn't just a lonely woman working too many hours and inventing mysteries to fill the empty spaces in her life. He appeared around 11:30, stepping out of the stairwell at the far end of my floor. I watched him through the glass walls of my office, my heart pounding, my hands frozen on my keyboard. He walked the same way he always did, slow, deliberate, unhurried. His uniform was the same worn navy, his face the same weathered mask I'd seen half a dozen times before. He moved down the hallway, checking doors that didn't need checking, peering into offices that had been empty for hours. I pulled out my phone and tried to take a picture. The camera app opened normally, focused normally, captured the image with a soft click. But when I looked at the result, the hallway was empty. Just glass walls and dark offices and the faint glow of exit signs at either end. No guard, no figure. Nothing but architecture and shadows. I took 3 more pictures as he walked past my office door, close enough that I could have reached out and touched him if there hadn't been glass between us. Every single one showed an empty hallway. He was there. I could see him with my own eyes, could track his movement from one end of the floor to the other. But the camera couldn't find him, wouldn't record him. It was like he existed in a frequency that technology couldn't detect. He paused outside my office. I stopped breathing. For the first time since I'd started watching him, he turned and looked directly at me, not through me, not past me, at me. His eyes were pale and flat, the color of old concrete, and there was nothing behind them that I recognized as human. No curiosity, no hostility, no emotion at all. Just awareness. Just the acknowledgement that I was there, that I'd been watching, that I'd been paying attention when everyone else had learned not to see. He raised one hand and pointed at me. A simple gesture, index finger extended, like he was marking me for something I didn't understand. Then he turned and walked toward the elevator bank, and I sat frozen at my desk, unable to move, unable to think, unable to do anything except watch him go. The elevator doors opened as he approached. I heard the chime from where I sat, saw the light above the doors illuminate. But I also saw the display panel, the one that showed which floor the car was on, which direction it was moving. The display was dark, no numbers, no arrows, no indication that an elevator had arrived at all. He stepped through the open doors and disappeared. I don't know how long I sat there before I could make myself move. Minutes at least. Long enough for the office to feel like it was pressing in on me, the silence too thick, the darkness beyond my window too absolute. When I finally stood up, my legs felt like they belonged to someone else. I walked to the elevator bank on autopilot, not sure what I was looking for, not sure what I expected to find. The doors were closed. The display showed all 4 elevators idle on the ground floor, where they parked overnight when not in use. There was no record of any elevator coming to 14, no log of any movement in the past hour. I checked the call buttons, the emergency panel. everything I could think of that might explain what I'd seen. Nothing. No explanation. No evidence. Just the faint smell of something old and metallic hanging in the air, like rust or copper or blood. I left the building that night and didn't come back for 3 days. Called in sick, stayed in my apartment, tried to convince myself that I'd hallucinated the whole thing. Stress and exhaustion and loneliness combining into something that felt real but couldn't possibly be. But on the 4th day, I got an email from building management. A routine notice sent to all tenants informing us that elevator maintenance would be performed over the weekend. And at the bottom of the email, almost as an afterthought, a single line that made my blood run cold. Please note, Elevator 3 will be out of service indefinitely due to unexpected structural concerns with the shaft. Elevator 3, the one he'd stepped into, the one with no record of ever moving. I had to know what was down there. Getting access to the elevator shaft wasn't easy, but I'd been working in this building long enough to know people who knew people. The facilities manager owed me a favor from the time I'd helped his daughter with her college application essays, and after some convincing and a promise not to tell anyone what I was doing, he agreed to let me accompany the inspection team when they went down to look at Elevator 3. The inspection happened on a Saturday morning when the building was mostly empty. I met the team in the basement level, a concrete maze of mechanical rooms and storage areas that most tenants never saw. There were 4 of us. The facilities manager, 2 technicians from the elevator company, and me, wearing a hard hat that felt ridiculous and carrying a flashlight I'd brought from home. The technicians gave me curious looks, but didn't ask questions. They had a job to do, and I was just someone in the way. The shaft for Elevator 3 was accessed through a heavy steel door in the mechanical room, locked with a physical key rather than an electronic system. One of the technicians explained that this was standard for elevator maintenance. You didn't want the electronic locks failing and trapping someone inside. The door swung open with a groan of hinges that hadn't been used in a while, revealing a dark vertical space that smelled like machine oil and something else. Something older, fainter, like the memory of decay. The technicians went down first, descending a ladder bolted to the shaft wall. I followed, my flashlight beam bouncing off concrete and steel, illuminating the cables and counterweights and mechanical components that made the elevator work. The shaft was narrower than I'd expected, claustrophobic, the walls pressing in from every side. I could hear the technicians below me, their voices echoing strangely, their footsteps clanging on metal rungs. We reached the bottom of the shaft, the pit, they called it, the space below where the elevator car stopped at the lowest floor. It was dark and damp, water pooling in the corners from some leak nobody had bothered to fix. The technicians spread out with their own flashlights, examining the hydraulics and the safety mechanisms and whatever else they'd come to inspect. I stood near the ladder, sweeping my light across the floor, looking for something I couldn't name. I found it in the corner, half hidden behind a tangle of old cables that should have been removed years ago. A uniform jacket, navy blue, faded almost to gray, the fabric stiff with age and moisture. It was folded neatly, placed against the wall like someone had set it there deliberately, like they'd taken it off and meant to come back for it. I crouched down and shone my light on the breast pocket, looking for a name tag, a logo, anything that might identify who it had belonged to. The name was embroidered in white thread, barely visible after decades of neglect. Beckman. My hands were shaking as I reached for it. The fabric was cold and damp, unpleasant against my fingers, but I lifted the jacket anyway, needing to see if there was anything else. Beneath it, pressed flat against the concrete, was a key card. Old technology, the magnetic stripe kind they'd used before everything went digital. The plastic was yellowed and cracked, but I could still read the text printed across the front. Whitmore Building Security, Earl Beckman, expires December 91. He'd died down here, fallen 14 floors, and landed in this pit, and somehow his jacket and his key card had ended up folded neatly in the corner, waiting for someone to find them, waiting for me. Hey, you okay over there? One of the technicians was looking at me, his flashlight pointed in my direction. You look like you've seen a ghost, I almost laughed, almost told him that I had, that I'd been seeing one for weeks, that the ghost was probably watching us right now from somewhere in the dark. But I just nodded and said I was fine, just found some old debris that startled me. He shrugged and went back to his inspection, and I slipped the keycard into my pocket without really thinking about why. The facilities manager found me later, after we'd climbed back up and the technicians had declared the shaft structurally sound but in need of significant repair work. He looked troubled, distracted, like something had been bothering him since we'd gone down there. "That thing you found," he said quietly when we were alone. "The jacket. I should tell you something about it." I waited, my hand closing around the keycard in my pocket. "There are stories about this building," he continued. "Old ones, from before my time. People say that after Earl Beckman died, things started happening. Guards seeing someone on their rounds who wasn't supposed to be there. Doors opening and closing on their own. That elevator, the one we just inspected, it would move to floors nobody had called it to. Go up and down in the middle of the night with no passengers, no explanation. Why didn't anyone do anything about it?" He shrugged, a tired gesture that suggested years of asking the same question. What were they going to do? Call an exorcist? The building owners didn't want the publicity, and the employees who noticed learned to ignore it. You work here long enough, you stop seeing things you don't want to see. It's easier that way. I thought about the guard at the front desk, the one who'd told me there was no one matching Earl Beckman's description on the night shift. Maybe he hadn't been lying. Maybe he'd just trained himself not to notice, the way everyone else had, the way I was supposed to. But I couldn't stop noticing. Couldn't stop seeing the man in the worn uniform, walking his rounds through a building that had killed him, passing through doors that should have required a key card he no longer had. That night, I stayed late again. I had to. Something had shifted since I'd found the jacket, since I'd taken the key card from the pit. The air in the building felt different, thicker, more watchful, like something that had been sleeping was starting to wake up. Around midnight, the elevator chimed behind me. I was alone on the 14th floor, sitting at my desk, pretending to work while every nerve in my body screamed at me to leave. I turned slowly, already knowing what I'd see. Elevator 3, the one that was supposed to be out of service, the one with structural concerns in the shaft. The doors were open, and Earl Beckman was standing inside, watching me with those flat concrete eyes. This time he smiled, and he gestured for me to come closer. I didn't move. Couldn't move, really. My body had locked into place, every muscle rigid, every instinct screaming at me to run, while some deeper part of my brain insisted that running wouldn't help. He was between me and the stairs. The other elevators were on the far side of the floor. There was nowhere to go that he couldn't follow. Nothing I could do that would matter against something that walked through doors without keycards and rode elevators that weren't supposed to work. His smile didn't waver. It wasn't a threatening expression, exactly. More like the smile of someone who'd been waiting a very long time for something and was finally seeing it arrive. He lowered his hand slowly, patiently, and when he spoke, his voice was like static on an old radio, crackling, distant, not quite in sync with the movement of his lips. "You found it," he said. "You found what I left behind." The key card in my pocket felt suddenly heavier, warmer, like it was responding to his words. I pressed my hand against it through the fabric of my jacket, some irrational part of me thinking I could hide it from him, keep it safe. But he already knew. He'd known since the moment I'd picked it up, probably. Maybe that was the point. "What do you want?" My voice came out steadier than I expected, steadier than I felt. "Why are you still here?" The elevator doors started to close, and he put out a hand to stop them. A casual gesture, automatic, the kind of thing you do when you've ridden 1,000 elevators and know exactly how they work. The doors froze at his touch, staying open, waiting. "I'm still here because I never left," he said. "This building holds on to things, holds on to people. I died in that shaft, and the building caught me before I could go anywhere else. kept me walking these halls, doing the same rounds I did when I was alive. 33 years now. Every night, the same floors, the same doors, the same nothing. There was something in his voice that I hadn't expected. Not anger, not menace. Exhaustion. The weariness of someone who'd been doing the same job for decades without rest, without relief, without any hope of it ever ending. "You're trapped," I said. I was trapped. He stepped forward, out of the elevator, and the doors finally closed behind him. The car didn't move, just sat there, waiting, as if it were listening to our conversation. "But you changed something. You took the key card. You took part of me out of that pit, and now there's a gap. A hole in whatever's been keeping me here." I pulled the key card from my pocket, held it up between us. The plastic was warm against my fingers, almost uncomfortably so, pulsing with something that felt too close to a heartbeat. "You want it back?" He shook his head slowly. "I want you to use it. Swipe it through the reader on that elevator. Let me through the door the way I was supposed to go 33 years ago. The building's been holding me because it caught me mid-fall, mid-death, mid-everything. I never finished dying, so I couldn't finish leaving. But if someone lets me through, if someone with living hands uses my key to open the way, I think I can finally go." I looked at the elevator doors, dark and silent, the out-of-service sign that had been taped over the call button now crumpled on the floor. The card reader was beside the doors, the same kind installed on every elevator in the building. I'd never thought about what it would mean to swipe a dead man's key card through a living system, never considered what kind of door that might open. "How do I know this isn't a trick?" I asked. "How do I know you're not trying to take me with you?" His expression shifted, something almost like sadness crossing those weathered features. "You don't. You can't. I'm asking you to trust a ghost, and I know how that sounds. But I've been watching you for weeks now, Margot, watching you stay late when everyone else goes home, watching you walk these halls like they're the only place you belong. You understand what it's like to be stuck somewhere, don't you? To feel like you can't leave even when you want to." I did understand. That was the worst part. I understood it so well that his words hit me like a physical blow, like he'd reached into my chest and found the thing I'd been trying not to look at for years. "I'm not like you," I said, but my voice had lost its steadiness. "I'm not dead. I'm not trapped. I can leave whenever I want." "Then why don't you?" I didn't have an answer for that. Didn't have an answer for any of it. Not for why I stayed late every night. Not for why my apartment felt like a waiting room I passed through on my way to somewhere that never arrived. Not for why the only place I felt real was an office building that apparently harbored the ghost of a security guard who'd been walking its halls since before I was born. Earl Beckman watched me with those flat, patient eyes, and I realized that he wasn't just asking me to free him. He was asking me to admit something I'd been refusing to face. That I'd made myself a ghost too, in my own way. That I'd been haunting this building just as surely as he had, just without the excuse of being dead. I looked at the key card in my hand, looked at the elevator doors, looked at the man who'd been waiting 33 years for someone to notice him, to find what he'd left behind, to care enough to help. "If this doesn't work," I said, "if something goes wrong, then you'll know," he said simply, "and you can decide what to do next. But I don't think anything will go wrong. I think you're exactly the person who was supposed to find me. I've been waiting for someone like you for a very long time." I walked toward the elevator. The keycard reader glowed faintly in the darkness, a small red light that would turn green when a valid card was swiped. I'd seen it happen thousands of times with living guards and living cards. I had no idea what would happen with this one. I pressed Earl Beckman's keycard against the reader. The light turned green. The elevator chimed, and every light on the 14th floor went out at once. The darkness was absolute, deeper than any darkness I'd experienced in a building full of exit signs and emergency lighting and the ambient glow of a city that never fully slept. I couldn't see my hand in front of my face, couldn't see the elevator doors, couldn't see Earl Beckman standing where he'd been just seconds before. All I could hear was the hum of the building's mechanical systems, ventilation, plumbing, the quiet pulse of electricity running through walls, and underneath it, something else. A sound like wind rushing through a space too small to hold it. A sound like breath being released after being held for 33 years. Then the elevator doors opened and light poured out. Not the fluorescent glow of a normal elevator car. This was something different. Warmer, softer, the color of late afternoon sun filtering through clouds. It filled the hallway, pushed back the darkness, and in that light I could finally see what was happening to Earl Beckman. He was fading, not disappearing all at once, but dissolving around the edges, his outline growing less distinct with every passing second. The worn uniform, the weathered face, the flat concrete eyes. All of it was softening, blurring, becoming transparent in a way that should have been terrifying but somehow wasn't. He was looking at the elevator, at the light spilling from its open doors, with an expression I recognized. Relief. The kind of relief you feel when a pain you've been carrying for so long finally stops, when a weight you'd forgotten you were holding is suddenly lifted. He turned to me one last time. His features were barely visible now, more suggestion than substance, but I could still see him smile. A real smile this time, not the unsettling grimace from before, the smile of someone saying goodbye. "Thank you," he said, and his voice was clearer than it had ever been, no longer crackling with static or distance. "Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for not looking away." He stepped into the elevator, into the light, and the doors closed behind him. I heard the car begin to move, not up or down, but somewhere else entirely, somewhere the building's normal mechanisms couldn't reach. The sound faded gradually, like a train pulling away from a station, growing distant and then silent. The lights came back on, all of them, all at once, the fluorescent panels overhead flickering to life like nothing had happened. I stood alone in the hallway, the key card still in my hand, staring at the elevator doors that now looked exactly like they always had. Elevator 3. Out of service. The crumpled sign on the floor, the only evidence that anything unusual had occurred. I pressed the call button, not expecting anything to happen. The elevator arrived 30 seconds later, empty and ordinary, its interior the same beige and chrome as every other car in the building. No golden light, no warmth, just an elevator doing what elevators do, carrying people from one floor to another, indifferent to the miracle that had just passed through it. I rode it down to the lobby and walked out of the Whitmore building for the last time that night. The key card was still warm in my pocket, though the pulse I'd felt earlier had faded to nothing. I kept it anyway. Still have it, actually, tucked in a drawer in my desk at home. A reminder of what happened. A reminder of what's possible when you stop looking away. The building management never figured out what caused the power surge that night. They blamed it on the ongoing issues with Elevator 3, accelerated the repair schedule, and had the whole shaft overhauled within a month. The facilities manager caught my eye a few times during that period, a knowing look passing between us. But we never talked about what had happened. Some things don't need to be explained. They just need to be acknowledged. I stopped staying late after that. Not because I was scared, though I'd be lying if I said I wasn't at first, but because Earl Beckman's question had lodged itself somewhere deep in my chest, impossible to ignore. Why don't you leave? Why don't you go home? I'd been treating this building like a refuge when it was really just a holding pattern, a way to avoid the harder work of building a life outside these glass walls. I started small, joined a gym, not because I cared about fitness, but because it gave me somewhere to go that wasn't work or my apartment. Reconnected with a college friend who'd moved to the city years ago and kept inviting me to things I kept declining. Started leaving the office at 6 like a normal person, eating dinner at a table instead of my desk, learning what it felt like to have hours in my day that belonged to me instead of my job. It's been 2 years since that night. I still work at the same firm, still walk through the lobby of the Whitmore building every morning, still ride the elevators to the 14th floor. But I'm not haunting the place anymore. I'm just working there, the way you're supposed to work somewhere, as a means to an end, not an end in itself. I see the night security guards sometimes when I stay a little later than usual or come in early to beat traffic. They're all alive, all accounted for, all carrying key cards that beep when they swipe them through readers. None of them walk with that slow, deliberate pace I remember. None of them pass through doors without permission. But every now and then, when the building goes quiet and the lights in the hallway flicker for just a moment, I think about Earl Beckman. I think about what it must have been like to fall 14 floors and never land, to walk the same rounds for 33 years without anyone seeing you, without anyone caring enough to ask why you were there. I think about how easy it would have been for me to become the same kind of ghost, not dead, but not really living either, just moving through spaces, filling hours, waiting for something I'd stopped believing would ever arrive. He asked me to see him, and I did. But the real gift wasn't the one I gave him. It was the one he gave me. The reminder that being trapped is sometimes a choice, and that doors can open if you're brave enough to use the key. I try to remember that now. Every day, in ways large and small, I try to keep walking through instead of standing still. It's the least I can do for a man who spent 33 years teaching me what it costs to stay in one place too long. Story 5. The drawer in my kitchen that opened on its own. The first time it happened, I blamed the house settling. I'd owned the place for 3 months by then, a 1950s ranch on a quiet street in a neighborhood full of retirees and young families. The previous owners had been an elderly couple who'd lived there for 40 years before moving to assisted living, and the house still carried traces of them everywhere. Wallpaper they'd chosen in the 70s, carpet that had probably been stylish once, a kitchen that hadn't been updated since the Reagan administration. I was planning to renovate eventually, but for now, I was just getting used to the rhythms of a house that had been someone else's home for longer than I'd been alive. The drawer was in the kitchen, third from the left, below the counter where I kept my coffee maker. It was the junk drawer. Every house has one, full of rubber bands and dead batteries and takeout menus from restaurants I'd never ordered from. I'd opened it maybe twice since moving in, just to see what was inside, and hadn't thought about it since. But that Tuesday morning, I came downstairs to find it standing open about 3 inches. Not all the way, not dramatically, just enough to notice. I stared at it for a moment, coffee mug in hand, trying to remember if I'd opened it the night before. I hadn't. I was certain I hadn't. But old houses shift and settle, floorboards expand and contract, and sometimes things that were closed don't stay that way. I pushed the drawer shut and went about my day. The second time was 4 days later. Same drawer, same 3 inches, same quiet morning when I was the only one in the house. I checked the runners, wondering if they were warped or misaligned, if the drawer was somehow sliding open under its own weight. Everything looked fine. The drawer sat level on its tracks, no obvious reason for it to move. I closed it again and told myself it was nothing. My name is Caleb Rhodes. I was 36 that spring, an accountant at a mid-sized firm downtown, living alone for the first time in 8 years after my engagement had fallen apart the previous summer. Rebecca and I had been together since our late 20s, planning a future that had seemed solid and inevitable until it suddenly wasn't. She'd moved to Portland with someone she'd met at a work conference, and I'd been left with a half-furnished apartment and the savings we'd been putting toward a house we were supposed to buy together. So I'd bought one myself. Not out of spite, exactly, but out of a desperate need to prove that my life was still moving forward, even when it felt like everything had stopped. The ranch house on Willowbrook Lane was supposed to be a fresh start, a place that was mine alone, where I could figure out who I was without Rebecca shaping the edges of my existence. The drawer kept opening. By the end of my first month noticing it, I'd found it open a dozen times. Always the same drawer, always the same few inches, always when I wasn't looking. I started paying attention, started listening for the sound of it sliding on its tracks, but I never heard anything. I'd leave the kitchen with the drawer closed, come back 10 minutes later, and there it would be, open again, patient, like it was waiting for me to acknowledge it. I installed a child lock, the kind that hooks over the inside of the drawer and keeps it from opening more than half an inch. The next morning, the lock was unhooked and the drawer was open. I tried a different lock, a magnetic one that required a special key to release. Same result. I even put a heavy cast iron skillet in the drawer, thinking the weight might keep it closed. The drawer opened anyway, the skillet sitting inside like it had never been disturbed. That was when I stopped looking for rational explanations. I started researching the house's history instead, digging through property records and old newspaper archives the way I'd learned to do after reading too many horror stories online. The elderly couple, Harold and Miriam Voss, had bought the house in 1982 and lived there without incident until they'd moved out. Before them, a family called the Dohertys had owned it from 1967 to 1981. Before that, the house had belonged to its original owners, a couple named Edwin and Pearl Hartley, who'd built it in 1954 and lived there until Edwin died in 1966. I almost missed the detail that changed everything. It was buried in a brief obituary for Edwin Hartley, 3 paragraphs in a newspaper that didn't exist anymore, digitized and forgotten in some archive nobody visited. Edwin had died of a heart attack at age 52, survived by his wife Pearl and his daughter Louise. But it was the last line of the obituary that made me stop scrolling, that made the hair rise on the back of my neck. Services will be held at Riverside Methodist. In lieu of flowers, the family requests donations to the Children's Aid Society in memory of the Hartley's infant son, William, who passed in 1955. An infant son. A baby who died just a year after the house was built, whose existence I'd found no other mention of in any of the records I'd searched. I went back through everything, census records, birth announcements, anything that might tell me more about William Hartley and what had happened to him. There was almost nothing. Just that single line in his father's obituary, acknowledging a child who'd been born and died in this house before I was even a thought in anyone's mind. I sat in my kitchen that night, staring at the drawer that had caused me so much confusion over the past weeks. It was closed now, but I knew it wouldn't stay that way. It never did. And for the first time, I found myself wondering not how it was opening, but why. What was in that drawer that mattered? What was I supposed to find? I pulled it open myself this time, all the way, and started taking everything out piece by piece. Rubber bands, dead batteries, a screwdriver with a cracked handle, takeout menus, expired coupons, a roll of tape so old the adhesive had turned to powder. I emptied the drawer completely, ran my hands along the wooden bottom, felt for anything unusual. My fingers caught on something at the very back, a seam in the wood that shouldn't have been there. A panel, I realized, fitted so precisely that it was nearly invisible. A false bottom. I pried it up with the screwdriver, my hands trembling, my heart pounding in my ears. The space beneath was shallow, maybe 2 inches deep, and it contained only one thing. A small wooden box, no bigger than my palm, with a tarnished brass latch. I didn't open it that night. I couldn't. Just sat there holding it, feeling its weight, knowing that whatever was inside had been hidden in that drawer for almost 70 years. And that something, or someone, had been trying to show me where to look. I opened the box the next morning, in daylight, with coffee in my system and the rational part of my brain firmly in control. The brass latch was stiff with age, but gave way without much resistance, swinging open to reveal what had been hidden inside for 7 decades. A lock of hair, fine and pale, tied with a faded blue ribbon. A photograph, small and square, the kind they used to take in hospitals. A newborn, wrapped in white, eyes closed, face peaceful. And a folded piece of paper, yellowed and fragile, covered in handwriting that had faded to the color of weak tea. I unfolded the paper carefully, terrified it might crumble in my hands. The handwriting was a woman's, elegant cursive that spoke of a generation that still valued penmanship. The letter was dated March 12th, 1955. My dearest William, you were with us for only 17 days. But you changed everything. The doctors say there was nothing anyone could do, that your heart simply wasn't strong enough for this world. I don't know if I believe them. I don't know if I'll ever believe anything again. Your father thinks we should move. He says this house holds too much sadness now, that every room reminds him of what we've lost. But I can't leave you, my darling. I can't leave the nursery where you slept, the kitchen where I warmed your bottles, the garden where I dreamed of watching you grow. If we go, I'm afraid you'll be forgotten. I'm afraid no one will remember you were ever here at all. So I'm hiding this where only you can find it. Your hair, your picture, the only proof that you existed outside of my heart. Maybe someday, when I'm gone too, someone will discover what I've left behind. Maybe they'll wonder who you were. Maybe they'll say your name just once, and you'll know that you weren't forgotten after all. I love you, William. I will love you until I stop breathing, and then I'll love you still. Your mother, Pearl. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time after reading that letter, the box open in front of me, the photograph of William Hartley staring up at the ceiling he'd never seen. 17 days. He'd lived for 17 days in this house, and then he'd died, and his mother had hidden the evidence of his existence in a drawer she must have thought would never be disturbed. But she'd been wrong about that. The drawer had been disturbed. By the Dohertys, by the Vosses, by me. Someone had filled it with junk over the decades, layered detritus on top of Pearl's secret without ever knowing it was there. And still, somehow, the drawer kept opening. Still, somehow, William kept trying to be found. I didn't know what to do with what I'd discovered. There was no one to tell, no family member to contact. Pearl and Edwin were long dead. Their daughter Louise would be in her 70s now if she was even still alive, and I had no idea how to find her. The box and its contents belonged to people who no longer existed, memories of a grief that had faded from the world, along with everyone who'd felt it. But the drawer had stopped opening. I noticed it that same day, realized with a start that it had been closed all morning without me touching it. I checked again that evening, and the next morning, and the morning after that. The drawer stayed shut. Whatever had been moving it, whatever had been trying to get my attention, seemed satisfied now that I'd found what it wanted me to find. I should have left it alone after that. Should have put the box back where I'd found it, or donated it to some historical society, or simply acknowledged that I'd solved the mystery and moved on with my life. But I couldn't stop thinking about Pearl's letter, about her fear that William would be forgotten. I couldn't stop thinking about what it must have been like to lose a child after 17 days and have no one to share that grief with, no community that remembered, no grave I could find in any cemetery database I searched. I started looking for Louise Hartley. It became a project, something to occupy the evenings that had felt too empty since Rebecca left. I traced the family through census records and marriage licenses and the sprawling digital footprint that even people born in the 1950s eventually accumulate. Louise had married in 1974, become Louise Kendrick, moved to Ohio, and then to Florida, and finally to a retirement community in Arizona. She had 2 children and 4 grandchildren. She was 71 years old, and she was still alive. I found her phone number through one of those people search websites that always feel slightly invasive to use. I sat with it for 3 days before calling, rehearsing what I'd say, trying to figure out how to explain to a stranger that I'd found her dead brother hidden in a kitchen drawer and wanted her to know he hadn't been forgotten. She answered on the 4th ring, her voice thin but clear, the voice of someone who'd lived long enough to stop being surprised by much of anything. Mrs. Kendrick? My name is Caleb Rhodes. I recently bought a house on Willowbrook Lane, the house your parents built in 1954. I found something I think belonged to your family, and I was hoping we could talk about it. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When she spoke again, her voice had changed, grown smaller and more careful. What did you find? I told her about the drawer, about the false bottom, the wooden box, the letter her mother had written to a brother Louise had probably been too young to remember. I could hear her breathing on the other end of the line, could hear the weight of 66 years pressing down on that breath. William, she said finally, "Oh my God, you found William." I didn't expect her to cry. She did, softly, the kind of crying that comes from somewhere deep and doesn't need an audience. I waited, giving her space, holding the box in my hands like it was something precious, because it was, I understood now. It was the most precious thing I'd ever found. "I was 4 when he died," Louise said when she could speak again. "I barely remember him, just impressions, really. A crib in the corner of my parents' room, my mother crying all the time, my father getting quieter and quieter until he barely spoke at all." She took a shaky breath. "They never talked about William after he was gone, never mentioned his name, never showed me pictures. I think it hurt too much. I think they thought if they didn't talk about him, they could pretend it hadn't happened." "But your mother kept this," I said. "She kept everything. She wanted him to be remembered." "She did." Louise's voice broke again. "She really did." We talked for almost an hour. She told me about her parents, about the years after William's death, about the way grief had shaped their family even when they refused to name it. I told her about the drawer, about the way it had kept opening no matter what I did to stop it, about the feeling I'd had that something in the house was trying to communicate with me. She didn't think I was crazy. She thought I was a miracle. "I'd like to have those things," she said near the end of our conversation. "The box, the letter, all of it. I know it's asking a lot, but he was my brother. I didn't get to know him when he was alive. Maybe I can know him now." I told her I'd send everything the next day. Overnight shipping, signature required, insured for more than the contents were technically worth. But before I hung up, I had to ask the question that had been nagging at me since I'd first read Pearl's letter. "Mrs. Kendrick, Louise, do you know where William is buried? I looked for a grave, but I couldn't find anything." The silence on the other end of the line lasted long enough that I thought she'd hung up. "He's not buried anywhere," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "My parents had him cremated, and my mother. She could never bear to scatter the ashes. She kept them in the house." My blood went cold. "Where in the house?" "I don't know. She never told me. I always assumed she took them when they moved to assisted living, but now I'm not sure." Another pause, heavy with implication. "Mr. Rhodes, I think you might want to keep looking." I looked at the kitchen drawer, closed and innocent in the morning light, and I wondered what else this house was trying to show me. I started searching that weekend, methodically, room by room. The house wasn't large. 3 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen and living room, and a small basement that had probably been impressive in 1954 and now just felt damp and slightly neglected. I checked everywhere I could think of. The backs of closets, the spaces behind furniture that hadn't been moved in decades, the shelves in the garage where the Vosses had left paint cans and garden tools I'd never gotten around to throwing away. The first new sign came on Sunday morning. I was in the spare bedroom, the one I'd been using for storage, going through boxes the Vosses had left behind that I'd been meaning to sort through since I moved in. Most of it was junk, old magazines, broken appliances, the accumulated debris of 40 years of living. But when I turned away to grab a trash bag, I heard something fall behind me. A soft thump, like something light hitting carpet. I turned back. One of the boxes had tipped onto its side, spilling its contents across the floor. And there, on top of the pile, was something that shouldn't have been there. An old photograph, black and white, showing a young couple standing in front of a house I recognized. My house. The same porch, the same windows, the same oak tree in the front yard, smaller then, barely more than a sapling. The woman was pregnant, her hand resting on her stomach, her face bright with the kind of hope that only comes before life has taught you how quickly things can go wrong. The man beside her had his arm around her shoulders, proud and protective. Edwin and Pearl Hartley, I realized, before William was born, before everything fell apart. I flipped the photograph over. Someone had written on the back in the same elegant cursive I recognized from Pearl's letter. Our new home, May 1954. God has blessed us beyond measure. I kept searching, but now I felt like I wasn't alone anymore. Not in a threatening way, more like having a silent partner who occasionally pointed me in the right direction. A door would be slightly ajar when I was sure I'd closed it. A floorboard would creak in a room I wasn't in, drawing my attention. Once, I found a small pile of plaster dust on the basement floor, directly beneath a section of wall that looked subtly different from the rest. The basement was the key. I'd been avoiding it, partly because it was damp, and partly because something about it had always felt heavy, watchful, in a way the rest of the house wasn't. But the more I explored, the more everything seemed to lead me back down those stairs. The wall with the different plaster was in the corner, behind the ancient furnace that had been replaced at some point with a newer model but never fully removed. I had to squeeze past rusted metal and old ductwork to get close enough to examine it. The patch was about 2 feet square, painted the same dingy white as the rest of the basement, but the texture was wrong, smoother, newer, like someone had opened a hole and sealed it back up. I went upstairs and got a hammer, came back down and stood in front of that wall for a long time, trying to decide if I really wanted to know what was behind it. Louise's words echoed in my head. She kept them, in the house. Pearl Hartley had hidden her son's keepsakes in a drawer for 66 years. It made a terrible kind of sense that she'd hidden the rest of him too. The plaster gave way easily, crumbling under the hammer's blows like it had been waiting to fall. Behind it was a small cavity, carved into the foundation itself. Not a professional job, but careful, deliberate, made by someone who wanted to create a space that would last. Inside the cavity, wrapped in rotting cloth that might once have been white, was an urn. It was small, smaller than I'd expected, though I'd never really thought about how large an urn for an infant would need to be. The brass was tarnished, nearly black, but I could still make out the engraving on the front. William Edwin Hartley. February 23rd, 1955. March 11th, 1955. 17 days, just like the letter had said. I lifted the urn out of its hiding place with hands that didn't feel like my own. It was heavier than it looked, or maybe that was just the weight of what it represented. A child who'd never grown up, a family that had never recovered. A mother who'd loved her son so much she'd built him a tomb in the basement rather than let him go. The house was silent around me. Not the comfortable silence of an empty building, but something deeper, something expectant. I stood in that damp basement with William Hartley's ashes in my hands, and I understood finally what I was supposed to do. Louise needed to know, not just about the box and the letter. She needed to know that her brother was here, had been here all along, waiting for someone to find him and set him free. Pearl had kept him hidden because she couldn't bear to let him go. But Pearl was gone now. Edwin was gone. The grief that had built this tomb had died with the people who'd felt it. It was time for William to rest somewhere else, somewhere he could be remembered without being imprisoned. I called Louise that night and told her what I'd found. She wept again, harder this time, the kind of sobbing that comes from the deepest part of grief. But when she spoke, there was relief in her voice too. Resolution. "Bring him to me," she said. "Please, bring him home." I promised I would. Made arrangements to fly to Arizona the following weekend to carry William's ashes across the country to a sister who barely remembered him but had never stopped wondering. It felt right. It felt like the ending Pearl had never been able to give him. But the night before I was supposed to leave, something else happened. Something that made me realize the story wasn't over yet. I woke at 3 a.m. to a sound I hadn't heard in weeks. A drawer sliding open in the kitchen, not the junk drawer this time, a different one. And when I went downstairs to look, heart pounding, I found it standing open the same 3 inches, patient, insistent, waiting for me to understand. There was something else hidden in this house, and William wasn't the only secret his mother had kept. The second drawer was in the kitchen island, on the opposite side from where I usually stood. I'd used it a handful of times for storing dish towels and oven mitts, but I'd never examined it closely. Now I pulled it all the way out, dumped the contents on the counter, and ran my hands along the bottom the way I'd done with the junk drawer weeks ago. Another false bottom. Same careful construction, same invisible seam that only revealed itself to fingers that knew what they were looking for. Pearl Hartley had been a meticulous woman, I was learning. Meticulous and secretive and haunted by things she couldn't bring herself to speak aloud. This compartment was smaller than the first, just deep enough to hold a leather-bound journal and a bundle of letters tied with string. The journal's cover was cracked and faded, the pages inside filled with that same elegant handwriting I'd come to recognize. The letters were addressed to Pearl, postmarked from a town in Ohio I didn't recognize, spanning dates from 1956 to 1963. I started with the journal. The first entry was dated April 1955, a month after William's death. I can't stop seeing him. Not in dreams, I don't dream anymore, but in the corners of rooms, in the shadows by the crib we haven't been able to remove. Edwin says it's grief, that my mind is playing tricks, that I need to rest and recover, and eventually I'll feel normal again. But I don't want to feel normal. Normal means forgetting. Normal means accepting that he's gone. I won't accept it. I won't forget. I'll keep him with me forever if I have to. The entries continued, chronicling a descent I recognized from textbooks and training seminars but had never witnessed firsthand. Pearl's grief had become something else, something that wrapped around her mind and squeezed until the boundaries between reality and desperation began to blur. She wrote about hearing William crying at night, about finding his blanket moved from where she'd left it, about the certainty, growing stronger with each passing month, that her son hadn't fully left this world. "He's still here," she wrote in September 1955. "I know it sounds like madness. I know Edwin thinks I've lost my mind. But I feel him, especially in the kitchen where I used to warm his bottles. He's waiting for something. I just don't know what." The letters from Ohio filled in the gaps the journal left. They were from Pearl's sister, a woman named Dorothy, and they painted a picture of a family torn apart by grief and fear. Dorothy begged Pearl to see a doctor, to consider a hospital stay, to do something before her obsession destroyed her marriage. Pearl's responses weren't in the bundle, only Dorothy's side of the correspondence, but I could infer what Pearl must have written from her sister's increasingly desperate replies. "Please stop talking about the baby as if he's still alive," Dorothy wrote in 1958. "You're scaring Louise, you're scaring Edwin, you're scaring me. William is at peace. You need to let him rest." But Pearl hadn't let him rest. She'd kept his ashes in the basement wall, his keepsakes in the kitchen drawer, his memory alive in a mind that couldn't accept his absence. And something about that refusal, that fierce, impossible love, had done something to the house itself, had imprinted her grief into the walls and floors and drawers, until even now, 70 years later, it was still reaching out, still trying to communicate, still refusing to let go. The last entry in the journal was dated December 1963, 8 years after William's death. "Edwin wants to sell the house. He says we need a fresh start, that Louise deserves to grow up somewhere that isn't saturated with sadness. He doesn't understand that I can't leave. William is here. If I go, I'll lose him completely. I'd rather die than let that happen. So I've made a decision. I'm going to stay. No matter what Edwin does, no matter where he tries to take us, I'm going to stay in this house. Forever, if I have to. I won't abandon my son." I set the journal down with trembling hands. The house was silent around me, but it was a different kind of silence now. Attentive, almost anxious, like someone waiting to see if they'd been understood. Pearl hadn't just hidden William's ashes in the basement. She'd hidden herself there too, in some way I couldn't fully grasp. Her grief had been so complete, so consuming, that it had outlived her body. She was still here, still walking these rooms, still opening drawers and moving photographs, and trying to tell someone, anyone, the story she'd never been able to speak aloud. I called Louise the next morning and told her everything. Read her passages from her mother's journal, summarized the letters from an aunt she'd probably never known existed. The silence on the other end of the line was different this time. Not grief, but something closer to understanding. "My mother was never right after William died," Louise said quietly. "I knew that even as a child. She'd talk to herself sometimes, especially in the kitchen. I thought she was just lonely. Now I wonder if she was talking to him." "I think she was," I said. "And I think she's still trying to talk. Not to William, to anyone who'll listen. She wanted someone to find what she'd hidden. She wanted the story told." "Then tell it." Louise's voice was stronger now, certain. "Tell everyone. Write it down. Let people know that my brother existed, that my mother loved him so much it broke something inside her. That's what she wanted, isn't it? To be remembered, to have someone remember." I promised I would. But first, I had one more thing to do. That night, I sat in the kitchen with Pearl's journal open in front of me and spoke to the empty room. "I found everything," I said, feeling foolish but also certain that I wasn't alone. "The box, the ashes, the journal, the letters. I'm taking William to Louise this weekend. She's going to scatter his ashes somewhere peaceful, somewhere he can finally rest." The house creaked around me, the old bones of a structure that had stood for 70 years settling into a new configuration. "But I need to know if there's anything else, anything you need me to find before you can let go." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, deliberately, the drawer beside me slid open once more. Not the junk drawer, not the drawer with the journal. A drawer I'd never opened at all. The one directly beneath the window, where morning light fell on a house that suddenly felt less like a haunting and more like a conversation. I reached inside and found one last thing Pearl Hartley had hidden, an envelope, yellowed with age, addressed to no one, sealed but never sent. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 7 words written in that familiar, elegant hand. "Tell Louise I'm sorry." I tried. I didn't know what Pearl had tried, didn't know what she was apologizing for, but I knew, with a certainty that went deeper than logic, that I was holding the last piece of a story that had been waiting decades to be finished, and that after this weekend, after I'd delivered William's ashes and Pearl's apology to the daughter she'd never been able to reach, this house would finally be quiet, not empty, just at peace. I flew to Arizona on a Saturday morning carrying a small suitcase and a box that held everything I'd found. William's ashes, Pearl's journal, the letters from Dorothy, the photograph of the young couple who'd built a house and filled it with so much hope and so much sorrow. The envelope with Pearl's final message I kept in my jacket pocket, close to my heart, because something told me that was the piece that mattered most. Louise met me at the airport. She was smaller than I'd expected, white-haired and fragile-looking, but her eyes were sharp and clear, the eyes of someone who'd spent 71 years learning how to survive. She hugged me like I was family, this stranger who'd found her brother in a kitchen drawer, and when she pulled back, there were tears on her cheeks. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you for bringing him home." We drove to her house, a modest place in a retirement community, surrounded by desert landscaping and the kind of aggressive sunshine that made everything look bleached and new. Her husband had passed 3 years ago, she told me, and her children lived on the other side of the country. She was alone most of the time now, just her and her memories and the questions she'd never been able to answer about the family she'd grown up in. I gave her William's ashes first. She held the urn in her lap for a long time, running her fingers over the tarnished brass, tracing the letters of a name she'd barely been allowed to speak as a child. Then I gave her the journal, the letters, the photograph of their parents standing in front of a house that had become a memorial without anyone knowing. She read for hours while I sat across from her, drinking coffee that had gone cold, watching her face shift through emotions I couldn't name. Sometimes she laughed, small, surprised sounds at memories she'd forgotten or never known. Sometimes she wept, the quiet tears of grief finally being allowed to flow after decades of being dammed up. When she finished, she set the journal down and looked at me with an expression I'll never forget. Gratitude and sorrow and something else, something that looked like relief. "I always knew something was wrong," she said. "I knew my mother was suffering in ways I couldn't understand, but she never talked about it, never let me in. I spent my whole life wondering if it was my fault, if I'd done something wrong, if I wasn't enough to make her happy after William died." I pulled the envelope from my pocket and handed it to her. "She left this. I think it was meant for you." Louise's hands trembled as she opened it, as she unfolded the paper and read those 7 words her mother had written 60 years ago. "Tell Louise I'm sorry." I tried. She pressed the paper to her chest and closed her eyes. When she opened them again, the tears were falling freely, but she was smiling. "She tried," Louise whispered. "She tried to be a good mother to me even when she was drowning. And she was sorry that she couldn't do better." She looked at me with those sharp, clear eyes. That's all I ever needed to know, that she loved me too, that William wasn't the only child she cared about. We scattered William's ashes the next morning in a garden Louise had cultivated behind her house. Desert flowers and succulents, and a small fountain that filled the air with the sound of running water. It wasn't the ocean or a mountain or any of the dramatic places people usually choose for such things, but it felt right. It felt like home. Not the home William had died in, but the home his sister had built out of a lifetime of quiet survival. Louise spoke a few words over the ashes, fragments of prayers and promises and the kind of things you say when you're finally letting go of something you've been carrying too long. Then she turned to me and handed back the urn, empty now. "Keep it," she said. "Put it somewhere in that house. Let it be a reminder that he was loved, that he mattered, that someone finally set him free." I flew back to Willowbrook Lane that evening, arriving at my house just as the sun was setting behind the trees. The same porch, the same windows, the same oak tree that had been a sapling when Edwin and Pearl Hartley had posed for their photograph. Everything looked the same as it had when I'd left. But something had changed. I could feel it the moment I walked through the door. The house was quiet. Not just silent, genuinely quiet, in a way it hadn't been since I'd moved in. The weight I'd felt in the basement was gone. The watchfulness I'd sensed in every room had lifted. The air felt lighter, cleaner, like windows had been opened after years of being sealed shut. I walked through each room, saying goodbye to whatever had been there before. Pearl's grief, William's unfinished life, the secrets that had been hidden in drawers and walls for 7 decades. They were gone now, all of them, released into whatever came next. I put the empty urn on a shelf in the living room where the morning light would catch the brass and remind me of everything I'd found. Then I sat in my kitchen in the house that finally felt like mine, and I thought about what it meant to let go. Rebecca had left me almost a year ago, and I'd been carrying that grief the way Pearl had carried hers, hidden in drawers, buried in walls, refusing to look at it directly because I was afraid of what I'd see. But Pearl's story had taught me something. Grief that gets hidden doesn't disappear. It just finds other ways to make itself known. It opens drawers. It moves photographs. It waits, patient and persistent, for someone to finally pay attention. I couldn't keep hiding from my own losses. Couldn't keep treating this house as a place to disappear rather than a place to live. Pearl had tried to hold on to William so tightly that she'd lost herself in the process. I didn't want to make the same mistake with the life I'd left behind. The drawer beside me stayed closed. All the drawers stayed closed, that night, and every night after. The house had said what it needed to say, and now it was simply a house again, walls and floors and windows, a place to sleep and eat and slowly, carefully figure out who I wanted to become. I still think about Pearl and William sometimes, especially on quiet mornings when the light comes through the kitchen window just right. I think about a mother who loved her son so much that she couldn't let him go, and a son who waited 70 years for someone to find him. I think about Louise in her desert garden, finally at peace with a brother she barely remembered and a mother she'd never understood. And I think about what it means to be found. Not just the dead, but the living too. All of us, carrying our hidden things, waiting for someone to notice the drawers that keep opening on their own. Sometimes the house you buy to escape your life becomes the place where you finally learn to face it. I'm grateful for that. More grateful than I can say.